in Council meeting of the 18th and 19th of February 2016. I shall give the floor, first of all, to the President of Council, Mr. Koenders. Minister.
Guten Tag. Guten Morgen. Mr. President, European Commission President, honorable members.
Pone pirmininkė, komisijos pirmininkė, džiaugiuosi galėdamas kalbėti Jums apie Europos vadovų tarybos susitikimą po vakar dienos.
A set of arrangements to address the concerns of the United Kingdom as set out by Prime Minister Cameron. However, given the urgency of the refugee crisis, EU leaders will also assess progress in implementation of earlier decisions and address any immediate issues ahead. The meeting will also make a new step forward in the European semester 2016 with the examination of the recommendation for the euro area. So a recommendation for the euro area as a whole. First, the United Kingdom. I think we all agree that the upcoming EU referendum in the United Kingdom is a political event of the first order for both the United Kingdom citizens and the rest of Europe. It will be up to the British people to make their choice. In this light, the current negotiations mark an important step in securing the UK's long-term relationship with the European Union. And although there may be difficult issues at the table, it is of paramount importance that we continue our constructive dialogue to make the European Union work better for both the United Kingdom and all other member states. Building on the fruitful discussion held at the December 2015 meeting, EU leaders will explore solutions to address the concerns raised by UK Prime Minister in November. All involved have shown readiness to work hard towards a mutually satisfactory solution. I believe it is in our common interest to adequately respond to the United Kingdom's concerns in a way that benefits all of the EU member states and institutions, and of course with full respect of the European Union's fundamental principles. As you know, yesterday the President of the European Council has put forward a proposal for a new settlement of the United Kingdom within the European Union. It covers all four areas of economic governance, competitiveness, sovereignty and social benefits and free movement. This proposal will be discussed later this week and next week by EU Sherpas and permanent representatives. Your Parliament will be represented at these meetings. Obviously, it is first and foremost for the heads of states of the European Council to decide to the President's proposal. Therefore, I cannot comment on this in detail today. All governments will now study the proposals, yet I do believe that it paves the way, this discussion, for an agreement in the European Council. Further discussions are of course needed and some of the issues are particularly complex, but I am sure a solution can be found if there is ample political will. The Council looks forward to working with the European Parliament as a partner in the follow-up of what we hope will be a good outcome of the discussions at the European Council for the European Union as a whole. Ultimately, though, the final decision will not be in our hands. It will be for the British people to decide whether the United Kingdom should remain in the Union. Mr. President, honourable members, you had a long and comprehensive debate on migration yesterday. I think it was a good debate. It's indeed essential to make progress on this key issue, which is mobilising all our institutions. The Presidency, the Commission and the EEAS will report on progress before the European Council meeting. You have shown the urgency of this matter yesterday. We have taken a number of important decisions last year. Implementation of these decisions is now our priority. And many of you have repeatedly made that point as well, and again yesterday. Further, developing a policy to secure the borders is of crucial importance. We should also make full use of the tools at our disposal to ensure humanitarian assistance where needed. The Presidency is fully committed to ensure that we improve on the results achieved so far. The central issues remain well-functioning hotspots, which are crucial in our efforts to address the migration flows, progress in relocation and resettlement, coordinated efforts between institutions and member states. This is crucial in particular to engage with key countries of origin and transit on all aspects of migration, including return and readmissions. We are engaged with Turkey to implement on both sides joint action plan commitments. Agreements should now be carried out fast. As President Tusk and Prime Minister Rutte stated at the last plenary, it is also crucial that we get Europe's borders under control. Work in the Council has therefore started rapidly on the Commission border package proposals presented in December. The Presidency is committed to ensuring the best and closest possible cooperation with the European Parliament on these proposals. We are convinced that they must lead to tangible results as soon as possible. The February European Council will be an opportunity to take stock of the situation in all areas and to address immediate issues ahead of the upcoming European Councils. Finally, the February European Council will examine the recommendation on the economic policy of the euro area as part of the European Semester 2016. You discussed the matter several times, notably last December in the presence of Eurogroup President Dijsselbloem. As you know, for the first time, this examination will take place in February rather than in June. We welcome this innovation proposed by the Commission as part of efforts to improve and streamline the European semester. The new timing means that discussions on individual member states will be informed by challenges common to the euro area. The European Council in March will, as usual, discuss priorities for the 2016 exercise and provide guidance to member states. I thank you very much, Mr. President, for your attention and look forward to our debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koenders. Now, for the European Commission, President Juncker.
Sehr verehrter
Mr. President, President of Council, ladies and gentlemen, members of the European Parliament, the next European Council will be devoted to two questions, and these crystallize a number of concerns about the future of Europe. The question of refugees and the question relating to the UK. Our conclusions will be looked at very closely, and many observers have comments on a daily basis, some of which are saying that this is a psychodrama where Europe is falling apart little by little, and others are saying that the European leaders are showing clairvoyance and vigilance for the long term. I think we need to put paid to the first and concentrate on the latter. And we need to deal with the refugee crisis. And although a lot has been said, there is an awful lot that needs still to be done. And in order to do that, we are going to have to take a new view, because at the moment we haven't got an awful lot that we can be proud about in our performance. The refugee crisis is day by day becoming a crisis of European solidarity, little by little, and we are going to have more coordination, more cooperation, and more union. Last year, I brought together around one table the leaders of the countries affected by migratory flows on the Western Balkans route, and I did that to ensure that there were talks and that there should be an understanding that the problems of one party were the problems of the others, and a process of cooperation would hopefully lead to a regular exchange of information, and that happened. I think accusing each other of not doing enough or doing things badly doesn't lead us anywhere. And it is incumbent on all of us facing this challenge to realize that this is a shared responsibility that must be enacted by all of us. Each of us must respect common rules, and in particular rules that relate to Schengen. There's only one way in which we can solve Schengen. It is by the application of the rules, all the rules. We will save Schengen by applying Schengen, and that is why
I'm happy to contribute to your good humor. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm there for that. C'est pourquoi.
That is why the Schengen evaluation mechanism's operation is a priority for the Commission, not so as to punish those where deficiencies are highlighted, but to rapidly identify corrective measures. This is what is going on now with Greece, where visits conducted last November on the maritime border between Greece and Turkey revealed serious shortcomings that Greece must absolutely remedy. It is not a question of isolating Greece, as some people are saying. That would make no sense. I never wanted a Grexit from the Eurozone, and I don't want to have a Grexit from Schengen either. And neither is it a question of stigmatizing the Greeks, who are under huge pressure, migratory pressure, and there have been a lot of individual gestures of solidarity towards refugees, many having been saved from certain death at sea by the Greek coast guards. And it isn't a question of stigmatizing Greece, but helping Greece to respect her obligations and correcting some of the shortcomings that may exist. And this is what the Commission has already done, and in particular with major financial aid and logistical support on the ground. Since last December, and following a request by Greece, Frontex has deployed a rapid intervention force on the external border of the Aegean Sea Islands, and furthermore, Frontex has also helped Greece to identify and register migrants on its border with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. But additional efforts by Greece are obviously going to be needed. The scope, nevertheless, will remain limited if the other member states don't apply the decisions which have already been taken, in particular decisions to do with strengthening staffing of hotspots and speeding up the relocation plan, and efforts will remain limited until we have a European Coast Guard and border control agreement reached, and it is down to all of us to contribute in a better way to protecting our common external borders if we wish to avoid these internal borders having to be reintroduced on a more long-term basis in Europe. But it is clear that the control of refugee flows and the future of the Schengen area is not only something that will be played out in Europe between Europeans, but beyond our common borders with the partners we have in third countries. First of all, we have the issue of readmission, and it must be clear to all of us that we have to intensify our efforts to ensure that all of those that do not meet the conditions to benefit from international protection should be rapidly returned. With regard to the return of irregular migrants from Greece to Turkey, until the readmission agreement between the European Union and Turkey enters into force, the Commission is ready to work in close cooperation with the Greek authorities and the Turkish authorities to accelerate those returns in the context of the bilateral agreement that exists at the moment between Greece and Turkey. It is indispensable that we should strengthen throughout Europe our return policy. It's an essential element if we are going to bring confidence back in the minds of our citizens in the face of the flow of refugees, and to enable us to focus our resources on those that do need international protection. In German. Mr. President, there has been a considerable effort to ensure that the action plan with Turkey is going to be followed with action. The Turks have reassured the Commission that they will shortly be doing everything they can to live up to the commitments that they entered into, and in order to combat trafficking bans and illegal immigration. But we too must live up to our commitments that we have made to Turkey. Turkey, in its territory, has almost 3 million refugees, and this is therefore a matter of urgency that the 3 billion euros that the EU has earmarked and will be coming from the member states should be made available. And I am delighted that in the meantime the Italian government has also recognized its part in the solidarity money. It is a matter of great importance for the European Commission that everything should be done to help refugees return to their countries of origin as soon as possible, and therefore the countries should not only be assisted, but should have real, tangible solidarity expressed towards them. And that not only applies to Turkey, it also applies to Jordan and Lebanon, which are dealing to a greater extent than we are the consequences of the Syrian collapse. These countries, Jordan and Lebanon, have the highest density of refugees that exist anywhere in the world at the moment. And it is a case that these countries are nearing the saturation point, and this is a fact that we mustn't lose sight of. The whole problem relating to refugees and the problem of refugees in Greece is obviously related to the situation of war in Syria, and whilst we in the international community have not succeeded in ending the war in Syria, we will feel the consequences of that war close to home. And the European Commission has, as of January, ensured that the humanitarian convoys to Madaya will be co-financed. But there are many Madayas, and there are hundreds of places in Syria where people are dying because aid is not reaching them, and this is not a state of affairs that we can sit by and watch. There is a trust fund that has been set up for Syria. The Commission has put in 500 million euros. The member states should be doing the same, and yet haven't hitherto done so, because on the behalf of the member states, there's 480 million out of the 500 million euros missing, and the same would apply to the urgency fund that we set up for Africa. The Commission has delivered together with the European Parliament, but the member states have not yet done so, and this must be remedied at the earliest possible opportunity. Fighting symptoms is important because it will mean that the lives of people affected will be improved, but we need rather more to fight the causes, and we need to do both. We need to provide help on the ground. And Mr. President,
President Tusk presented his proposed new settlement for the United Kingdom in the European Union. Let me be clear from the start. The European Commission has been fully associated to the work on this settlement. The Commission's best experts have worked over many months to find creative solutions. I have worked closely with President Tusk and Prime Minister Cameron to shape the proposal presented yesterday. Therefore, the Commission supports this text. I have always said I wanted the UK to remain a member of the European Union on the basis of a fair deal. The settlement that has been proposed is fair for the UK and fair for the other 27 member states. It is also fair for the European Parliament. The European Parliament has a key stake in the process and a crucial role to play. Many of your members have been involved already. I salute the contributions of President Schulz, Manfred WEBER, Gianni PITTELLA, Mr. KAMALL and Guy Verhofstadt, amongst others. As of Friday, your Sherpas will take part in the discussions leading up to the decisive European Council of the 18th of February. President Schulz will be sitting at the table in the European Council. All understand that the European Parliament must be fully signed up to the new settlement. If the citizens of the UK deliver a positive verdict, you will be called upon to deliver crucial legislative elements on the settlements. I will not take you through the main elements of the settlement. That's, by the way, a duty for the President of the European Council and not so much for the one of the European Commission. But like Prime Minister Cameron, we all want the European Union to become more competitive and to create more jobs. We must not stifle innovation and competitiveness with regulations that are too prescriptive, too detailed, notably when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises. That's why the Commission has shortened and streamlined its annual work programmes, withdrawing a greater number of legislative acts than it proposes. That's why it is so important, as the Commission and as the Dutch Presidency are saying, that's why it's so important to complete the single market, to build out energy union, to complete the digital single market and to establish a capital markets union. This is the programme of the European Commission, and I appreciate the support of the United Kingdom in that respect. The settlement proposed by President Tusk recognises that not all Member States participate in all areas of the EU policy. The UK benefits from more protocols and opt-outs than any other Member State. This is why, as a matter of law and as a matter of fact, the concept of ever closer union has already assumed a different meaning in its case. The settlement recognises this. It recognises that if the United Kingdom considered that it is now at the limits of its level of integration, then that is fine. At the same time, it makes clear that other Member States can move towards a deeper degree of integration as they see fit. In this way, we have addressed the Prime Minister's concern while respecting the treaties. I advocated from the start of my election campaign that national parliaments should play a greater role in our democratic system. I included this pledge in the political guidelines on the basis of which you elected this Commission. The settlement presented yesterday provides for this. Mr.
President, I would wish to preserve the integrity of the single market whilst we deepen our economic and monetary union. The agreement proposed by President Tusk respects both of those imperatives. The proposals of President Tusk aim to protect the legitimate interests of member states participating in the internal market who yet are not members of the Eurozone. And it is legitimate to give those member states an opportunity to go to the European Council if they think that the principle of non-discrimination might have been violated. It is legitimate for those member states not to have financial responsibility for measures that have been taken to guarantee the stability of the Eurozone. At the same time, there is a red line whereby having more Europe within the Eurozone and strengthening the single currency, that has been respected. The euro remains the currency of the European Union, and the Parliament remains the Parliament and that of the Union as a whole.
Difficult discussions we had with our British colleagues related to free movement. The settlement addresses situations in which large-scale movements of EU nationals are not related to the attractiveness of labour markets, but to the structure and the generosity of social security systems. We propose to create a safeguard mechanism, tailor-made to the concerns of the United Kingdom, that would allow it to restrict the access of EU workers newly entering its labour market to in-work benefits in a graduated manner for a period of up to 4 years. The duration of the mechanism will be limited in time. That's a crucial characteristic of a safeguard mechanism, necessary in order to make it compatible with the treaties. It will apply in exceptional cases, as all derogations from the 4 freedoms should. In 2004, the UK did not use the transitional periods that would have allowed it to phase in the right of free movement of the citizens of 8 new member states. As a result, over the past decade, the UK attracted a record number of mobile EU citizens. In effect, we will enable the United Kingdom to use the safeguard mechanism to address the consequences of that decision. In einem Wort wie in 1000.
The agenda of the European Council for the week after next is very dense, and I know that I, as ever, will have the support of the European Parliament. I know that I can count on it when it counts. The European Commission and European interests will be dealt with as a priority by them. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much. We now have the debate, and first of all, for the European People's Party, Chairman Weber.
President, colleagues, the aim is quite clear for my group, the EPP. What we want is for the UK to stay on board, and we want the people of the UK to be convinced of the fact that it's better to stay in the family. And I'd like to thank Mr. Juncker for the effort that's been made. Of course, Mr. Cameron has fought hard for his particular views, but we don't want a British Europe. We want a proposal that would be a Europe for all, better for all. That ought to be the centerpiece of the discussion. And we support fully less democracy, more competition, also the issue of the euro, and I think we ought to be quite thankful that the euro is the core of Europe. But there has to be coexistence, there has to be a concerted effort as well for maintaining things as they stand with regard to the euro. So these are positive sides. And then there's one particular point which the Commission referred to, and that is the issue of fighting any sort of abuse of the social system. Citizens that work in the UK, they pay taxes and they want certain benefits as well. Now, those individuals which will be denied access to the social security system, this is a problem. This isn't correct. But on the other hand, we have abuse of the system as well, and we have to forge some sort of balance. This is one of the most difficult issues indeed. Now, in the EPP, we will, of course, support this particular discussion, the dialogue. We want a positive result with these negotiations, but undoubtedly this is one of the most difficult issues. Cameron fought hard, but there's an issue of leadership as well that has to be taken into consideration. And what is the core of the British issue? Is it really the issue as far as the directive on working hours, children's support? What are the issues? What we want, however, is to transcend all of the smaller points and to keep the UK in the family. Would it be better for the UK to be alone, to be outside of the family? Wouldn't it be better for it to be able to negotiate within the larger European space? Or would it be better for it to negotiate alone? I think that particular question has to be asked. Is it better to be in? Is it better to be out? These are the questions which the citizens of the UK will have to respond to. And I think that people will be convinced that it's better to be a good patriot, to love one's country, and if that is all, it's better for the UK to be within the European Union, for citizens of the UK to be citizens of Europe as well. Now, as about the atmosphere in the Council now. Now, I think the Council ought to introduce an additional agenda point as well. The future of the Council ought to be put into the agenda because it is indeed a meeting of those who are suffering through different types of anxiety, through those who are experiencing the anxiety that is created by self-centeredness and by a nationalism as well. So we have to look at this very carefully. That is the particular atmosphere that prevails right now. So you have to really take a look at yourselves and see what your remit, what your tasks, what sort of responsibilities exist before you. So I think indeed if now with regard to the internal market, the creation of jobs, the Schengen space, numerous different conflicting views have been presented which are threatening Europe overall. To keep the euro on track, a historic issue, the establishment of a currency, of a major currency covering such a large area, an entire continent, the reunification of Europe, all of these particular questions, these issues, all of this required courage to create. So we have to fight against populism, and the Council has to be on the forefront of this particular fight. So are these particular questions really going to be asked by those politicians, by those leaders who will meet in Brussels in 2 weeks' time? These key questions, I see more a kind of historical collapse or failure in numerous different sectors. So this is going to be a major test indeed. My major issue for the Council is, and what I would like to beseech the Council to do, is to look at these key issues and respond to them. Finally, something that concerns us internally, the reform as far as financial policy, economic policy, and once again, we have to look at what's being done at the national level, and the numerous different tendencies that exist, which unfortunately diverge very much from the financial policy which has been adopted. We have numerous different divergences, and we have separatists and nationalists which want basically fragmentation. And for this particular reason, I'd like to call for all. We have to call out and say Europe and Democrats have to stick together for us to have a proper, common European future. Thank you.
Mr. Weber, Mrs. Grapini would like to put a question to you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. It is for the first time, Mr. Weber, that I would like to congratulate you for your speech. I hope I will also congratulate you after answering to my question. Do you agree to what Mr. Juncker is proposing? You are leading a very large parliamentary group. Do you agree with this mechanism to restrict the free movement of workers?
Ich hatte das ja ausgeführt, weiß nicht genau, ob es
Now, I hope that the EPP does want an agreement. We want the UK to be in Europe, and of course we have to find some sort of agreement which will be acceptable to both sides, and the basis which was presented by Mr. Juncker, by Mr. Tusk as well, those particular proposals establish a sound basis, I feel, for future discussion.
For the Socialist and Democratic Group, Mr. Pittella.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to say once again today that we are very concerned. In Europe, things really are not going very well. The acts carried out by neo-Nazis in Sweden and Germany, the idea of people firing on refugees, even children. There's a kind of virus that's infected Europe, the virus of fear. Jean-Claude spoke about a psychodrama. And no country, no political party seems to be immune from this virus, and all these ideas are being attacked. Schengen, the right for humanitarian assistance, respect for human lives. And so it's not just the duty of this House to talk about technical solutions for these problems, to respond to the migration crisis. There are solutions. The Commission has set them forth very clearly. We already have procedures in place to enhance external border controls, to use hotspots and identification, redistribution throughout European member states, but the system just isn't working. And it's not working because it's being blocked by selfishness and fear, by electoral considerations. So it's a politico-cultural problem. Selfishness, fear, electoral concerns, nationalist views, these things have never helped build Europe. So if we want to provide effective responses, we need to change direction in Europe and go back to our values. And it's populism that's stopping too many governments from shouldering their responsibilities. And instead of speaking about issues which aren't really terribly relevant to this debate, references to Spain and Portugal, that's just looking for excuses. In Spain and Portugal, the political leadership appears to be
working towards strengthening European integration. There's no question about that. But let's focus on the real dangers. Let's not turn aside. Let's not mistake what our targets ought to be. Otherwise, we're playing into the hands of the opponents of Europe. We have a duty to say things clearly to our citizens, to say that it's a moral duty to help those escaping from the barbarous attacks of ISIS. People who are learning our languages or want to find a job, because that's the only response that will work. We need to say clearly that Schengen is the answer to the crisis, it's not the problem. And the Commission's package on migration and revising Dublin, that's significant too. On the UK, Mr Tusk's letter can be useful in terms of clarifying the UK's role in Europe. During the negotiations, we can ask for more clarification, particularly on the issue of workers' rights, where we are very concerned. But it needs to be clear that our commitment as Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament exists because we want the UK to stay in the European Union. It's crucial for the EU, as Jean-Claude Juncker said. It's also essential for the UK that it stays in the European Union. A UK outside the EU is weaker, and it's also in the interest of European citizens, particularly for those citizens in the UK who are less comfortably off. We need to be able to speak clearly about the advantages, the benefits that UK citizens get because of their continued membership in the European Union. And that's the way we can rediscover our values, the values that have led us here as representatives of the great successful democratic experiment of the European Union. That's the way we can solve our crisis. That's my appeal to you. Thank you very much, President.
Herr Pittella, ganz überraschenderweise gibt es
Quite surprise from MEP Finch. There is a question for you, Mr. Pittella. Please, Mr. Finch.
Mr. Pittella, you mentioned earlier the Portuguese and Spanish governments were working towards European values, and yet youth unemployment there is closing up on 50%. Is it not true that the EU policies of supporting bankers rather than the ordinary working people and the youth of these countries is the problem and not the solution?
Guardi, a fare generalizzazioni è...
Well, having or making accusations and accusing people is easy. Talking about unemployment, youth unemployment, that's something which we need to address in a very responsible fashion. There are certain things that need to be corrected in European economic policy. We need less austerity, we need less toughness, and we need to support recovery and job creation, definitely.
The floor now goes to the ECR, to Mr. Kamall.
When I first became an MEP in 2005, it was around the time that the French and the Dutch had voted no in their referenda on the European Constitution. And as we stood here in this Parliament and considered the implications of those no votes, I was shocked by the number of MEPs who just simply wanted to ignore the results and push on with further European integration. But perhaps the most shocking moment for me was when the then leader of the EPP stood up and said, "Nothing must be allowed to get in the way of the European project. Nothing must be allowed to get in the way of European political integration. Nothing must be allowed to get in the way of European economic integration." And as a British MEP, the belief in the European project, where the eventual goal was to build a United States of Europe or a Federal Republic of Europe, was news to me. There and then I realised that there was a massive gap in the perception between many in the EU institutions who believe in this European project and the people of Britain, many of whom tell me that they believe that they voted to stay in a common market. But reading more about the history of the EU, I realised that the political dimension of the EU has been played down by politicians of all parties in the UK for the last 40 years. And it is still being played down. In my first few weeks here in the Parliament, I was approached by a British MEP who asked me to join a cross-party group, a cross-party federal group, to support the British project, to support the European project. If only it was a British project. And when I said to him, "Have you told your voters this?" I found out he was saying one thing here and a different thing in his constituency. So unless this gap in perceptions is resolved, the UK will continue to have an ambiguous relationship with the EU. And this is why David Cameron was absolutely right to call this referendum to give the British people a say. Because we should never be afraid to ask the people what they want and then to stick by the outcome. A large number of voters I speak to say they do not yet know how to vote and that they will wait to see the details of the deal. Rather like going to a shop and someone promising you a great deal in a couple of weeks and asking you to commit now, they want to read the small print. But Donald Tusk's letter to the European Council and his draft proposals are a good place to start on the 4 areas set out by the British Prime Minister. Mutual respect between the Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries. The EU becoming more competitive by opening the single market, cutting red tape and increasing global trade. Ever closer union not applying to all countries, with national parliaments playing a larger role. And freedom of movement to work and not to claim. And those people who move should only get something out of the system once they've put something in. And it's hard to see how these are just British questions. These are matters that should benefit all European Union countries. But the next few weeks will see a lot of travel, a lot of papers being read, a lot of persuading being done. And as the Council seeks a final deal, and once the deal is done, the real debate begins. Because for this referendum to be meaningful, it needs a full, frank and honest debate, with both sides being clear what remaining in the EU means and what leaving the EU could mean for Britain and for the EU. And those of you who want to build your project of the United States of Europe, come to Britain and tell the British people if that's what you believe. Don't hide your views until after the referendum. Mr Verhofstadt, that's an example, as you say. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we say. It doesn't matter what Donald Tusk or David Cameron says. It doesn't matter what politicians on both sides of this debate may say. It doesn't matter what we say in the European Parliament or what they say in the Westminster Parliament. At the end of the day, it is the British people who will have the say. It is time for the British people to have their say for the first time in 40 years. Please, on all sides of this House, respect that. Thank you.
Herr Kamall. Herr Kamall.
Mr. Kamall. I have a question for you. Mr. Coburn has asked to put a question to you. But just a second, Mr. Coburn did hold up his blue card before you'd even started speaking. So I'm just wondering, just a second, how can you put a question on a speech that hasn't yet been held? We will no doubt find out.
Dankeschön, mein Präsident. Mr. Kamall, thank you for taking my question. You're always a good sport. Mr. Kamall, if you want a fair British immigration policy, can you have that within the EU?
Well, Mr. Coburn, thank you very much. And I must say, I admire your abilities to predict my speech. I think in future I might actually ask you to write some of the speech. Or actually, when I'm struggling for words, I can ring you up and say, what do you think will be my speech tomorrow? But actually, in this case, you asked a very fair question and something that has to be put to the British people. If you want immigration policy, what you call a fair immigration policy, that everyone outside the UK is treated equally, whether they are from Austria or Australia, Croatia or the Caribbean, Italy or India, you cannot achieve that by remaining in the EU. And that is something you have to be honest, but you have to make that clear to the British people. What I don't like when your party talks about immigration is trying to imitate the BNP and be anti-immigration. Thank you.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die
Now for the Liberal Group, Chairman Verhofstadt.
Mr. President. I will start today where I ended, in fact, yesterday, because we got yesterday with Mr. Koenders a whole debate about the refugee crisis. And I'm pleased now, Mr. Koenders, that at the request also of the Commission, the refugee crisis will be the main topic on the agenda of the summit of 18 and 19, because whatever the importance of the British issue is, let's be honest, the refugee crisis we are facing is far more important, I think. And that is what we have to show to our citizens, that we are capable to solve this. And again, Mr. Koenders and Mr. Juncker, my request to you is to put two proposals on the table of the 18th. First of all, this rapid response force. Why not using Article 78, paragraph 3 of the treaty, to advance the European Border and Coast Guard? You can do that, so without a change of legislation. And immediately to start to send these 2,000 civil servants from the national border agencies the fastest as possible, because you have said it, Mr. Juncker, the latest report of the European Commission was a disaster on the border between Greece and Turkey. 4 of the 5 hotspots are not there. There is no fingerprinting control, there is no registration in an appropriate way. That's not my findings, findings of the European Commission. So my proposal is, again, do that. Propose 78 as the basis to launch this rapid response force immediately. And secondly, let's also consider that idea that the 3 billion, we're going to change that in a direct aid, financial assistance to the people in the camps, in refugee camps, instead of giving that to the Turkish government. And I completely agree with Mr. Weber when he said, yeah, if the Council is not capable now to take in such a situation, such decisions, then you have to ask yourself why we have created the European Council. Because in the treaty they say, oh, the strategic options, that is a competence of the European Council. Well, you're not capable to take strategic options. That you are in fact demonstrating and illustrating every time. So I hope I'm wrong. I hope that Mr. Weber is wrong and that the European Council this time can make a surprise by taking decisions that are really making the difference. And that brings me then to the official topic of the summit, the request of the United Kingdom to renegotiate its position. So let me be very clear, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President. I think it would be a huge mistake if Britain would leave the European Union, and not so much economically, Mr. Kamall. I think most of all geopolitically. I think Britain without Europe, okay, it's a dwarf, let's be honest. We Belgians, we know that we are dwarfs, but maybe they're going to know it also. And on the other hand, Europe without Great Britain, yeah, doesn't count, is not a counterweight against China, against Russia, against the United States, against America. It's in fact Putin, Mr. Kamall, who wins in this game in the end, because Putin likes a divided Europe. Mr. Farage and Mr. Putin, that are those who want a divided Europe. And so I'm very sympathetic to the request of David Cameron, the aim to reform Europe. The question is only, what we have received yesterday on the paper of Mr. Tusk, is that what we really need? And I have in any way, with the 4 points, not so much problems, but only with 1 point of these 4 points. That is the point, Mr. Koenders, that in my opinion you have to rewrite completely in the coming days in the Sherpa meetings and in the European Council. When Mr. Tusk is saying, well, an ever closer union is not an ever closer union. That's in the text. It has nothing to do with sharing values. It has nothing to do with more political integration. I thought, I have to tell you, that Marguerite and surrealism was only part of Belgian culture. But I see now it's also part of Polish culture and of the culture of Mr. Tusk. You know that painting of Marguerite, well, we show a pipe and then we put in French, ceci n'est pas une pipe. Well, it's a little bit the same in this proposal of Mr. Tusk. An ever closer union is not an ever closer union, and in 1 page he explained that what is in fact the difference. Well, I have to tell you, not only it's in contradiction with Article 352 of the treaty, but I think maybe it's better to have another option. Instead of really destroying in one page our project of political integration, why it's not better than to give a new opt-out to Britain? They have a number of, they have an opt-out in Schengen, they have an opt-out in the euro, they have an opt-out for police coordination, they have an opt-out for at least 7 different elements today. What will create a second opt-out? The reality is that we have a two-tier Europe today. Okay, if they want a next opt-out, I think that is better than to do the opposite and to destroy the idea of an ever closer union because Britain has to stay. No, I think it's better to be honest to the people and to create an additional opt-out. And then finally, on the emergency brake, and I'm going to finish, Mr. President, it's going to be discussed in the normal legislative procedure, this emergency brake, but let's be honest, Mr. Juncker, I hope that is the last time. We did an emergency brake from Mr. Sarkozy in Schengen. Maybe tomorrow Mr. Renzi asks one for the Stability Pact. Maybe after tomorrow Mr. François Hollande asks one for the internal market. I think it's enough. Okay, give Mr. Cameron his emergency brake, but stop then to destroy the Union with emergency brakes in all directions. Thank you.
Herr Verhofstadt, es gibt eine Frage des Abgeordneten Su.
A question from Mr. Sulík for you, Mr. Verhofstadt. Yes, please.
Vielen Dank. Herr Verhofstadt, Sie sagten, Griechenland.
Mr. Verhofstadt, you said that Greece isn't protecting its borders properly, but the Commission said that indeed there is a lapsus here. Why not exclude Greece from the Schengen zone, kick it out? It means that one of the rules are not being adhered to. Europe has a major problem because people aren't adhering to the rules. We see that with the euro, with Dublin II, with numerous different such agreements. So I think now we have to have the courage basically to follow the rules and to adhere to all of those particular regulations that have been put in place.
Why we are not in the same group? I'm a positive person and you're a negative one. Instead of pushing immediately Greece out, I think let's take our responsibility with the European Union. We have a common border of Schengen. Let's protect it and manage it together with a European border and coast guard. That seems to me a positive European result than to exclude members of the Union. That's the difference between you and us. Yeah?
Vielen Dank. Das Wort hat jetzt für die.
Thank you very much. And now for the United Left, Madam Zimmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The upcoming summit has 2 tasks that have been mentioned today. First of all, to talk about the negotiated package, looking ahead to the referendum in the UK, and how member states overall will react to that, and secondly, the refugee issue. And I think for both of these, the key issue is the question about the future of the European Union. What are our ideas about that? What responsibilities are there, and how are we going to deal with a one-sided approach to deciding the future of the EU and the extent to which the citizens of the European Union will actually be able to identify with this project? I would like to start with this proposal that has been put on the table yesterday. I think one of the basic criticisms would be that if we want more democracy in the European Union, we cannot have a situation where decisions are taken outside of the formal framework of the European Union. Mr. Juncker, you said previously, and this was also said by the representative of the Dutch presidency, that the European Parliament is involved. I think that's great. I don't think, however, there's a single word about the European Parliament in what Mr. Tusk has presented. There is no role for the European Parliament here, and the European Parliament, however, is supposed to be involved in the follow-up. Well, fine, but the decision's been made, and what is our participation? I think, Mr. Juncker, the European Parliament isn't just made up of a few gentlemen and a few groups. The European Parliament is, and its opinion formation, is to be derived from the discussion that we have here. This is is lacking, and yet if the door is to be opened in the future as to how decisions on the future of the European Union are to be made, and I think we're going to increasingly lose credibility. We cannot allow the citizens of Europe to think that that is only we that are asked. We are supposed to represent them here. The second point I wish to make is this idea of the social union being buried. It is pretty clear to me that, having read what I've read, that is the case. There is not a compromise on offer here. It is simply bending the knee to the City of London. And I don't know whether we are absolutely clear in our minds about what that would mean if one of the four freedoms is divided by two, if the principle is, look guys, when it comes to mobility, this idea of equal pay for equal work in the same place, well, we're going to in the future make a difference. What will that mean for the future social development and employment protection in the UK, but also in the other member states too? We are making an opt-out for a path where anybody in future can choose what they want, and we are deciding here and now that this is supposed to be democratic and is going to be put into the next revision of the treaty. And if we are dealing with the issue of taking influence and wanting to make clear, well, there is added value in the European Union for the citizens of the UK if the UK remains, and we're making a huge mistake if, when it comes to the social issues, we start dismantling everything, because people will take a second look at that, and it's not just a question of those who represent the City of London.
ETHERIDGE möchte Ihnen eine Frage stellen.
Colleague Average would like to pose a question, Madam Zimmer.
Thank you. Good morning. You refer to bending the knee to the City of London when it comes to concessions to the UK negotiation. Would you, in your opinion, rather see the EU and the UK go separate ways than for in any way the EU to acknowledge the concerns of the UK, which, by the way, isn't just the City of London, it's the whole country, as shown by the fact that UKIP won the European elections?
If you're trying to tell me that UK represents the entire population of the UK, then I think that's a rather weird idea of the law and of democracy. I am saying quite clearly that there are different points of view in the UK, and it's not just the interests of the financial markets and the interests of the big banks that should be taken into account in the future of the European Union, but the representatives of the citizens, and that would be those that have work and those that don't. And I think there are different points of view in your own country.
Thank you. Now for the Greens, the chairman, Madam Rebecca Harms.
Presidents, dear citizens in the United Kingdom, I don't know how often during the last years we discussed on this vote going to come soon, probably. And nobody doubts that this vote is the vote of the citizens of the United Kingdom. But since it is about the European Union, it matters for all of us. And to be honest, I sometimes don't know whether in the United Kingdom everybody is aware of the fact that the result of the vote will matter for millions of citizens across the European Union. So you decide in the United Kingdom, but I think it's very important that you know that the majority of citizens across the European Union, not only the Germans, want the UK to stay in the European Union. So how to exchange, how to achieve an honest exchange on this issue in between citizens of UK and citizens in the European Union? For me, it's also, since we discussed recently on Poland, before we discussed on Hungary, before we had years on discussions on values of the European Union in the context of Greece and the euro crisis, for me it's again one of those moments where we have really to talk Europe, to talk about Europe, where we came from, for example. And this is very simple to say. We really came from war. We achieved peace. And so looking to the east, looking to the south, looking to our neighborhoods, don't forget what we really achieved. Where are we? So looking to the Minsk agreement, looking to the Iran deal, looking to the climate deal achieved in Paris recently. So the European strength is visible again and again. Looking to challenges still ahead, Syria, growing terrorism, soon probably 100 million of refugees globally. So what you really say in the UK, all those challenges you will deal better with outside of the European Union? So sorry, you shout, but shouting is not at all about arguments. Yesterday my colleague Smith, from UK, from Scotland, he said, let's look so the wood and not only the trees. So let's become serious about what keeps us together. I have one idea. I don't know whether it's a too small idea or it's maybe not convincing, but when I go home to my region, and I can't go often, I sit together with my neighbors. I have a cup of tea. We are talking about our gardens and we are talking about Europe. And so let's be honest, there must be more exchange in between the citizens of UK and us. And so invite us for this famous cup of tea. Let's create possibilities before the vote to really talk about lilies, about roses. I like to do it as a gardener. I really appreciate the Britons as the nation of gardeners. But let's create true situations to talk about us, about the Britons and about Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Frau Harms.
Mrs. Harms.
Der Earl of Dartmouth.
The Earl of Dartmouth has a question for you.
Thank you very much for taking the question. What Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, has described as the UK's emergency brake on benefits requires a majority in the European Parliament. Will you and your group be voting for the emergency brake on benefits?
So you can be sure that especially my colleague Jean Lambert, as she always did, will try to achieve at its best social responsibility on the European level. The idea of the social Europe has its cradle in my group, and Jean Lambert, well known also in the UK context. You can trust in her that she takes care of all the social issues.
Thank you very much. I would like to call you to order. I think Mr. Farage needs to bring his troops into line. Mr. Farage now.
Yes, thank you. I think they're slightly over-enthusiastic. Well, it wasn't supposed to be like this, was it? Because Mr. Cameron's renegotiation began with really big intentions. Treaty change. He was going to question blue cards going up already. This is going to be fun. He was going to control the free movement of people. He was going to achieve a fundamental change, not just in Britain's relationship with the European Union, but reform the EU itself. And what we got was a letter from Mr. Tusk, in which there's no treaty change, no powers returned to the United Kingdom, and no control over our borders at all. In fact, it was hardly worth the wait. It's really rather pathetic. But there is, of course, one more chance for the Prime Minister, because he goes to the European Summit in a couple of weeks' time. And like Oliver Twist, he will parade in front of the other leaders and say, please, can we have some more concessions? I find it rather humiliating that a British Prime Minister has to do this, but I'm certain of one thing: he won't get another thing. Because just look at the substance of this. We have an emergency brake on migrant benefits. Wow! It was supposed to be a total ban on migrant benefits for up to 4 years. So it is hardly an emergency brake, it's more of a handbrake turn. And the Prime Minister is saying we've got a red card. Isn't that wonderful? Well, what that means is, if a majority of parliaments in the European Union can say to Mr Juncker they don't want one of his directives, is that a cause for celebration? I mean, if 15 parliaments couldn't stop a piece of law, we'd be living in a communist dictatorship. And what I've gone through here are the good bits. But the most bizarre thing is Mr Cameron said with this deal he would now vote for Britain to join the European Union. So let's have a little think about that. If the question in June was should we join the European Union, we'd have to tell the British people you must surrender the control and sovereignty of your parliament and have 75% of your laws made somewhere else. Your Supreme Court will not be supreme. You will be overruled by a court in Luxembourg made up of people who aren't even judges. You will have to give up your fishing grounds, including, in some places, 200 miles of the North Sea, and you must cut your links with the Commonwealth and the wider world because you're no longer fit to negotiate your own global trade deals. Oh, and by the way, for all of this, you'll be paying £55 million a day as a membership fee. Would the British people vote for that? Not a snowball's chance in Hades. And all we have to do is recognise that whilst the politicians and the big banks and the big businesses will in this referendum defend their own vested self-interests, it's people power that will win this referendum, and after we've won this referendum, I hope in many other countries in Europe too.
Yeah.
Mr. Farage. My colleague Scott CATO has a question for you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to have the opportunity to say that as a British member here, I'm embarrassed and ashamed by the rude and disrespectful behaviour by the UKIP members here. And I would like to ask Mr Farage if during the forthcoming campaign he will do anything to control the behaviour of his members.
One moment, please. Now, one of the basic rules of democracy is that you listen before responding. So, please, listen to what the individual has to say before commenting.
Seconds. I want to say that I'm embarrassed and ashamed by the behaviour of UKIP members here today and their disrespect for other members, which ironically I find to be extremely un-British. I would like to ask Mr Farage whether he is going to attempt to control his members and prevent them from this sort of intimidation both inside the chamber and more widely on social media during this campaign.
I don't know whether you have a television in your house or not, but if you do, you might have watched Prime Minister's Questions, and you might have seen that actually in elected assemblies all over the world there is vigorous, lively debate, and there's sometimes even humour too. How about that? The most vociferous members I've known in this Parliament since I've been here are our President, when he led the Socialist Group for many years, and indeed Mr Verhofstadt, who leads the Liberal Group, who very often have shouted or mocked things that I've said, and frankly, as an elected representative, I'm big enough and ugly enough to take it, and so should you be.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die ENF-Fraktion Frau.
For the ENF, the chairwoman, Madame Marine Le Pen.
Mesdames et Messieurs les députés.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, the Brits have had enough of the European Union. It looks like they want to get out of the EU. They regret the loss of their sovereignty, the inability to solve problems at a national level. They've got their own way of looking at it, their own culture, the questions of immigration, the economy, or whatever. Mr. Verhofstadt said that we're having a discussion about this, but Mr. Verhofstadt doesn't seem to be particularly interested in what's going on. But I think he must be looking at things through some sort of distorting mirror, because this dwarf European Union, which doesn't show respect for any of the major problems of the world, has no interest in sorting out major conflicts or restoring some balance, is simply putting us into a situation where we're humiliated by President Obama, who rings up Mr. Cameron to ask him to stay in the European Union, who actually speaks after the November attacks before the President of the French Republic, who is talking about keeping in this insane policy of receiving migrants. There's a crisis which is getting increasingly serious in the European Union, the crisis of the single currency, which has mutated into a social crisis throughout the European Union, the migratory crisis, millions of people walking towards this Europe without borders, which is open to all, and the European Union is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The negotiations that are opening now is just theatre. I don't think anyone's being taken in by this masquerade that the Brits can improve what's happening in the European Union and stay in. It simply isn't going to happen. That's the situation. Every day we're trying to cobble together some response to the worsening situation. It's all based on blackmail, threats, violations of the rights of people expressed through referendums. It's a sign of the weakness of Europe, and finally we're seeing a step back, and we can be pleased at least about that. You can't keep wasting time infinitely. Finally this whole thing will be seen for the charade that it is, and will collapse completely, and people will get their sovereignty back.
Frau Le Pen.
Madam Le Pen, prior to the initiation of your speech, Mr. Verhofstadt left the room. I'm not quite sure about why, but there is a question now from Mr. Coburn, excuse me.
Madam Le Pen, do you think that the people sitting in Calais trying to get to Great Britain are speaking with their feet about what they think of the European economy, and that if they want a brighter future, and I don't blame them, that they want to get to Britain where the future is brighter, against the European Union which is falling to bits?
Madame Le Pen.
I fear that some people are in Europe at Calais because the UK has a border and we don't. If we had our internal borders back, if we weren't in this ridiculous Schengen, then people who are living in the shanty towns around our cities or in the areas of departure to get to the UK would very probably be back home. So it's vital that countries get their borders back, and not that the UK give up its border. That would be a terrible idea, I think.
Der nächste Redner wäre normalerweise der
Speaker would be colleague Kovac, but he's not in the room. So he will be represented by colleague Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. President. After the flurry of activity yesterday over the Prime Minister's deal, many in my constituency are asking, what was it all about? Having read the draft agreement, we see that the renegotiation of our relationship with the EU amounts to little more than a choreographed talks process, a faux battle, a smoke and mirrors charade that has resulted in little more than the status quo. I'm saddened to say a failure of our Prime Minister to stand up for our United Kingdom. Treaty change Retaking control over our laws has disappeared, and a promise to return control over our borders has been watered down to a benefit curve that has to be agreed by Brussels. The ever-present issue of the cost of membership has not even been addressed, a cost estimated to rise by a further €3 billion by the Office for Budget Responsibility in 2020. I'm delighted that the democratic process will now take control. I look forward to a frank and honest debate over our relationship with the European Union.
Thank you very much. Now, Herbert REUL. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, when one speaks with the average citizen these days, one feels, there's this palpitating concern and worry. And when one speaks further, one sees that it's absolutely necessary in this increasingly globalized world that we jointly resolve the various problems that exist. We all know that the problem is that there is no proper negotiation because things cannot be implemented, or because there is no negotiation power of the European Union. We have the European Council. The European Council, however, is catastrophic these particular days because they are unable to negotiate. The capability exists, but it is not being implemented, so to say. So we have to go beyond personal interests. We have to have solidarity. Repeatedly, people speak about the necessity to act in a spirit of solidarity. We can't work when we simply all look for our own personal interests, particularly in financial policy, in fighting against terrorism, in dealing with refugees. These are issues that have to be dealt with concertedly. We can't have leadership if we don't work together, leadership in Europe if we don't work together. In order to resolve these issues. People can't just do things on their own in an individualistic fashion, particularly when it looks at fighting terrorism, refugee policy, and all of those major issues which have to be dealt with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enrique Salam.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber, a little message. You being worried about the Hungarian group, the Hungarian government, which is a shame for your group. You have actually talked about the Spanish Socialist Party, which has now received the mandate to form a government. It was actually during the presidency of a socialist government when Spain entered the European Union, let me remind you. A government led by Felipe González, one of those leaders which you yourself this morning said we need in Europe if we are going to move into a proper future in Europe. Let me say that an important issue in the meeting is, of course, the question of migration. 2 weeks ago, the Council and the Commission said that we've only got 2 months to sort this problem out. 2 weeks have gone by. A quarter, that's to say, of the time which we have to deal with this matter. Have there been changes? Has there been progress? Have the measures which have been previously adopted been applied? Well, no, no and no. Yesterday we had Commissioner Avramopoulos with us, who said that in January we'd had more people coming in and more people dying. And a new hotspot had been set up. 4 out of the total of 30 which we're supposed to set up are now operating. So, as certain other colleagues have said, it's good that the European Commission is keen to make sure that migration is on the agenda for the European Council meeting. But I hope that next time we meet, we won't have to deal with this issue again as if it was Ravel's Bolero, the same music coming back but louder and louder every time. Thank you.
A minute and a half now for Hans-Olaf HENKEL.
President Schulz yesterday said that there would be no extra portions for the UK. Well, let's not deceive ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because if the UK were to leave the EU would surely but certainly demise. And I think, Mr. Reul and Mr. Weber, I need to say to you, gentlemen, just bear in mind who is the second biggest net contributor to the budget. And finally, the country that understands its people will be leaving this Parliament. So the proposal that Prime Minister Cameron has brought about is not only good for the UK, but good for Europe. Subsidiarity is always better than centralism. And taking responsibility for yourself is always better than taking responsibility for the bank and other debts of everybody else. And, ladies and gentlemen, the currency has to face up to cultural and other requirements, and we mustn't subjugate ourselves to the requirements of a single currency. I think, unfortunately, Mr. Verhofstadt isn't here because in his modest way, he said he was a very positive person, and having characterized one of my people as negative, I would say to him, we need an opt-out from people and policies of the kind of Mr. Verhofstadt.
Henkel, Sie haben eine blue card des Kollegen.
A blue card from Mr. LeBreton. Mr. LeBreton, you have the floor. Your blue card.
Thank you for taking the question. Mr. Henkel, you talked about the UK leaving the EU, which is it will be the end of the Union. And you talked about subsidiarity, but don't you think that a subsidiarity Europe will be impossible as long as we have the Commission in Brussels? Are you in favour of Europe of nations, yes or no?
The best thing that the European Union has given us so far is the internal market, and this is something that we have to retain whether or not the UK leaves. I'm not in favour of a United States of Europe myself. I'm in favour of a Europe of sovereign states.
So, jetzt für 2 Minuten.
2 minutes now for Madam Catherine Peter.
For Mike, yes. So the proposals for British changes are on the table. The negotiations can start, and in the UK the referendum campaign begins in earnest. The anti-Europeans and nationalists in Britain depict the UK as isolated in Europe, constantly bossed around by Brussels. They say Britain is too small to take a leading role in the EU, that we are constantly pushed around. And then they claim that outside the EU we would be a world leader, taking on the rest of the world. This is a complete contradiction. We know that Britain can only play a bigger role in the world by playing a bigger role in the EU. Britain has always been an influential member of the European Union. In the 1980s, the UK led the creation of the single market, which has increased competitiveness across the EU and increased British-EU trade by 55%. Only in the EU can we get the best deal for British consumers, driving down prices, allowing British businesses to grow and prosper with our neighbours. Being part of the EU is better for Britain under all circumstances, better for our prosperity, our security and our environment. But the renegotiations should not be only about getting a better deal for the UK, but for all the countries in the EU. Together we will all be stronger, creating opportunity, peace and prosperity for the future generations of this great continent. The people I meet up and down my country want to know that the future for their children and grandchildren will be bright, prosperous and stable. They want a Europe to be the engine of science and technology and innovation, driving the world to a cleaner and more sustainable future. Only in together with the EU can we secure this future. The best deal for the British public is a strong Britain in a strong European Union. As the most internationalist and outward-facing party, the Lib Dems are committed to keeping Britain a full member of the EU, because we are focused on the bigger issues at stake. The reason why Britain and Europe are together stronger, safer and more prosperous together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, your intervention has yielded 5 demands for blue cards. I'm going to admit one, and that's Bill Etheridge. Are you prepared to answer it?
No, I think we've had enough blue cards already today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker then for a minute and a half is Martina Anderson.
Thank you. Sinn Féin wants to see the creation of a social Europe, a Europe of democracy at its core, and a Europe that is closer to citizens. It's clear that the right-wing agenda of these institutions and several EU leaders is being put before the needs of citizens. The failed policies of deregulation, austerity, discrimination and scapegoating are at the heart of the EU reform agenda heading into February's Council. Cameron and Tusk's vision for Europe is that of a race to the bottom and of disregard for the concept of human rights and equality, and along with the attacks on workers' rights and migrant rights contained in these proposals, the agenda of the British Government is to undermine the human rights as evident in its proposed repeal of the Human Rights Act, which gives effect to the European Convention of Human Rights. You know, Brexit and the repeal of the Human Rights Act have implications for Ireland, have implications for the Good Friday Agreement, and there's not a mention of that. So whilst the EU is in need of radical reform, it's clear that these proposals are pushing the EU reform in the wrong direction. In most international agreements, disputes or otherwise, it's all about the economy, stupid. In the case of Brexit, it's all about human rights, stupid. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Smith wants us to ask a question of you, if that's okay. Please make sure that the question is really directed to Ms. Anderson.
Absolutely, President. Thank you. I'm grateful to my Irish colleague for giving way. And coming from Scotland, the diversity of the United Kingdom is, of course, very important, where we have very different domestic politics. We have elections in the north of Ireland and Scotland and Wales in May. Would you agree with me that it's a democratic outrage for the vote to be held in June? That would be disrespectful to Northern Irish, Scottish and Welsh democracy. And further, given that we have different attitudes to the European Union within Scotland, the north of Ireland and Wales, would you agree with me that it would be a democratic outrage for those countries to be taken out of the EU against our democratic will?
Thank you for that question. I think I would absolutely concur with what you're saying with regards to Ireland's places in Europe, just as you're saying Scotland's places in Europe. And we hope that an English vote on this does not result in the north of Ireland being taken out of the EU, and therefore we would argue that for the north of Ireland, and perhaps you're saying the same for Scotland, that there should be a separate referendum and it should be calculated and counted separately, and that should be respected.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for adhering to the time limit. Jill Evans now for a minute and a half. No, Ms. Grapini, Mrs. Evans is going to speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, President. I represent Wales, and EU membership has brought positive economic, social and cultural benefits. I also believe that the EU has benefited from having Wales as a member. There's a great deal about the EU that I would like to change, but we can only do that by working with our European partners to improve policy and make the EU more effective. We are far better off working for change within than shouting from the sidelines. The UK government wants more subsidiarity. Well, so do I, and that is why the proposed changes to be discussed in Council must be fully considered too in terms of their impact on the devolved governments of the UK. There must be a proper debate involving those governments, and I regret that the UK government has not done that to date. It's a matter of democracy and fairness. My party, Plaid Cymru, is committed to remaining in the EU, and I believe that the majority of people of Wales want that too. And if Wales votes to remain in, we should not be dragged out against our democratic will. And that is why we've called for a mandate to leave only if the 4 constituent parts of the UK agree to leave. I want to engage people in an open and honest and a fact-based and a mature debate about this, because it's a decision that will affect many generations to come. Thank you. Diolch.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Evans. You have a blue card from Mrs. Grapini. Are you prepared to answer that?
Yes.
Mrs. Grapini, please.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted an intervention on the procedure, but I have a question. If we lift the blue card when our colleague starts talking or after, because I was compliant with the discipline. My question to Ms. Evans is the following. Do you plead for the EU? I want European Union and we do not want Brexit. But what do you think of what the Commission and Council say? We have two Europes, countries that are in Schengen area, countries that are outside. Do we have a united Europe or not, according to you? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I believe in making a much more democratic Europe, and that's why I think that there are other regional and national levels of government, small nations, that are currently excluded from the decision-making process, and that if we had a stronger voice for that level of government, it would encourage more democratic participation and build a much better and stronger Europe for the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Evans. And now for a minute and a half, Rolandas PAKSAS, please.
Mr. President, colleagues, today is probably the time again to speak for us about the critical and complicated situation in the European Union. And tomorrow, the Mediterranean Sea is going to bring us yet another portion of migrants. I remember several other sessions where we would speak about similar things. We would speak about the need to strengthen the EU's external borders, to deal with the people smugglers. Ladies and gentlemen, why everything ends only with talks? Why in months and months the southern borders of the EU have more gaps as previously? Where are those smugglers who have been caught? Where are the seaports where confiscated ships stand? The renewal of the Schengen area is not going to tackle our problems. Nobody would need to establish fences or take other measures if we had secured EU's borders previously. Let us show solidarity in preserving our external borders, all of us united by showing solidarity. That would be a good step towards the Europe of nations or the Europe of states. Let us not be afraid of UK's proposal that is going to strengthen the Europe of state and not the Europe of federal states. These are good proposals, and the European Union politicians would not be exempt from being judged if we would not be able to make use of these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a blue card from our colleague, Mr. Szanyi. Mr. Szanyi, please.
Thank you, President. My question continues on the lists which you made about the problems with a view to the Mediterranean region. Recently, we read about an NGO in Germany that last year 60,000 children without a companion entered Germany through the German borders. How do you explain this particular fact, sir?
Well, to explain this fact, there are many versions, and I think that one of these versions would be the attitude towards the future of Europe and the creation of federal globalist Europe, saying that 28 member states and national parliaments is a complicated system which is not capable of ensuring efficient governance. I think that the truth lies not here. I think that each and every state must be equal. We have joined the union of equal states, and I think that we must live in the union like this. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Jetzt für 1,5 Minuten.
Thank you very much. For a minute and a half, Mr. Wilimsky. We are discussing nothing more and nothing less than whether one country out of 28 countries can go the road it wants within this European Union, or whether it will be leaving the European Union. There's nothing God-given about the European Union. It isn't a holy writ. It's not a law of nature, and the European Union is a club, and you can always leave a club, and the club can change its rules, the rules that hold it together. And against that backdrop, I certainly understand that the UK wishes to determine its and protect its own labour market at times of high unemployment, where no labour market can remain open for the whole of Europe with all of the problems. I understand the Brits when they say that their own social security system is one they wish to stabilise. It's not possible for a country to solve all the problems. I understand the Brits when they say that they want security within their country. They want to have control back of their borders, and they want to know whether people have terrorist or jihadist backgrounds and they're trying to get into their country. And how that decision pans out, we'll see. But I would wish the Brits the very best in that process, and I hope that there will be pressure for reform of the European Union. One thing I would tell you, in a democracy, it is not you or the Commission or we who are right, it is the population, and we must respect that. Thank you.
Danke, Herr Wilimsky. Es spricht jetzt für eine...
Thank you, Mr. Wilimsky. Now, Mr. Sotirios ZARIANOPOULOS.
On the question of refugees, a key issue in the Council. In today's debate, we've seen the views which have been put forward. But if we ask ourselves, what about people who are from trying to get away from Islamic State, which has already caused thousands of victims? We're closing borders, ensuring that more people will die. And there are also now workers who are becoming refugees because of the search after profits. In Greece, we have huge numbers of refugees, victims of propaganda, fleeing from Nazi-type regimes. And we can see what's happening at the borders, and people are now being subjected to the European border agencies, and all of this shows that the European Union is working along with bourgeois governments. They're all capitalists. That's all that they care about, and all they're talking about is making more war, making more profits, and making more refugees. Thank you.
So, jetzt spricht für 1,5 Minuten der Kollege.
For a minute and a half now, colleague GRZYB.
Takie trudne sprawy jak te, które stają na agendzie najbliższej Rady, to najbardziej potrzebne jest zaufanie.
There are items on the agenda for next council, and we have some faith in that. But we do have a problem. How are you going to solve the migration problem? How are you going to solve the problem of closing of borders if there is a lack of confidence one in the other? That is a primary requisite for this to work. We need it. We need freedom of movement. We need the internal market, and all of these are prerequisites. So too is Schengen. It's been said that if a lorry has to wait 1 hour at a border, it costs €55 for that hour. I think Mr. Juncker said that, and freedom of movement is also related to another topic on the agenda for the summit, the question of Brexit. All solutions that have been tabled relate to the whole of the European Union and not just for the UK, and I think the proposal by the President of the Council will allow freedom of movement to be maintained and not curtailed. I think it would be wrong to bring about discrimination irrespective of where citizens come from. Of course, if there is abuse, then reaction must be forthcoming. Thirdly, the declaration on subsidiarity and the role of the national parliaments is being emphasized. I think that those are things that need to be improved.
Roberto Gualtieri, please, for 1 minute. The participation of the UK in the European Union is something of a strategic nature, and it is something not only for citizens of the UK important, but for all European citizens. So it's absolutely necessary to forge an agreement which would provide for further integration, monetary integration and other, on the one hand, and on the other hand, recognize rights of those who've decided not to adopt the euro. So there are different levels, different speeds as well, and this is enshrined in legislation as well. So a good agreement has to be achieved. Of course, improvement has to exist, and we have to something which is legally much more solid and robust. First of all, establishing a clear distinction between the various grades and levels which would be incorporated within the opt-out options which exist. So these are to be negotiated over the days to come. Now the Council in its statement with regard to the euro area has made quite clear the importance of following particular rules which are...
Next speaker for 1 minute is Anna Fotyga.
Dziękuję. Chcę afirmować konwencję wiedeńską o...
Thank you very much. The Vienna Convention on treaty right is binding on all states, and I would assume that the right of the Brits will be upheld. There will be a change to treaties, but it will have to be done in negotiated in the context of the Vienna Convention.
Chair, it is for the British people to decide whether this so-called deal is good enough for either an in or an out vote. But I personally think that there are actually much better reasons for the Brits to vote for in, because in these times of globalization and the internet age, it would be better for Britain to be in the European Union for reasons of the economy, trade, but also security, police and justice cooperation, and the geopolitical position. But I would like to say, and in particular to all the self-proclaimed defenders of democracy on that side of the House, who have disappeared by now incidentally, that this is not only for the British people. This affects all EU citizens, and they actually don't have a say. And I do note that this deal contains a lot of, red cards, emergency brakes, and I would say Europe has got plenty of paralysis. We don't need more paralysis, we don't need more brakes, we actually need a stronger ability to act, to face all the big challenges, and I hope that we'll have the Brits on board for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a request for blue card, colleagues. I cannot admit any more blue cards, though, because otherwise the debate will run way into the votes. I hope you're with me on this. The blue card incidentally came from Luke Flanagan, who has the floor now anyway for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr Juncker, I'd appreciate it if you'd listen to my question. It is now generally accepted that when the euro was launched, it lacked even the most basic structures to deal with the crisis situation. Ireland was one that was hit with a crisis situation. On Monday, ECB President Mario Draghi was in this chamber. I pointed out that the report of the Banking Inquirer in Ireland stated that over 9 billion could have been saved but for the threats of and bullying of his predecessor, Mr Trichet. The 9 billion is gone, but there's an even greater injustice happening in Ireland just now. In 2009 and 2010, in the absence of any official structures to deal with troubled banks, the ECB, the Central Bank of Ireland and the then Irish government colluded to create 31 billion to bail out the failed creditors of 2 insolvent European banks. This was done not to save the banks, they were non-systemic, but to protect the euro itself, to protect the entire eurozone banking system. It worked, but now the ECB insists that the entire 31 billion must be taken out of circulation by our central bank. Already we borrowed and destroyed 6 billion. Our central bank still owns 25 billion, awaiting the same fate. On Monday in this chamber I asked Mr Draghi if he would work with us, the Irish MEPs, to help end this obscenity. I got no reply, Mr Juncker. Today I ask you, will you work with us to help end this obscenity? You talk about what's important, the refugee...
Mr Flanagan, you are overrunning your time and you're not speaking to the point on the agenda. I'm sorry. 1 minute now for Jean Lambert. Jesus Christ.
Thank you, President. I think your microphone was on a little long there. I wanted to start by just talking a little about subsidiarity. We're going to hear a lot about that over the next few weeks in the UK, and of course it's about making decisions at the lowest appropriate level. And that can be parish, it can be global, it can be the European Union. And in terms of the refugee situation, there we have a clear need for cooperation and coordination beyond an intergovernmental approach. And that cooperation based on a clear commitment to fundamental rights and international obligations. And it's a duty of the Parliament to remind Council of those values. So that clear need for international cooperation on this and many other issues is one of the reasons why my party will support a Remain position in the referendum, despite the desire for change that we have about the European Union. And I wanted to make that clear to the House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lambert. Pier Nicola Pedicini, a minute and a half, please.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, President. President Juncker, in the last few months, Council has set up a strategy full of good intentions, and which, at first sight, looks like it could actually be useful in doing something about the emergency of migrant flows, which is now massive and is happening at our borders as we speak. But as far as we're concerned, the implementation of this strategy still leaves a great deal to be desired. It's not possible to try to bring in a programme of agreed resettlement without genuine cooperation with African countries. And this can only work if the EU can adopt a strategy to do something about the emergency, which is now chronic in nature, freeing itself from slavery to the interests of individual member states who are trafficking in weapons, individual member states who are exploiting resources from these countries, and individual member states who close themselves off in their own borders. What's happening with migrant flow management in Europe is emblematic of the failure of the whole European project. Countries in the north are unloading an international problem onto the countries of the Mediterranean, and they're closing themselves off in Schengen and thinking that they're safe from everybody else in the world. But they forget about the problems which are caused in the Mediterranean because of the boats off the coasts. Don't say we're anti-Europeans and you're pro-Europeans, because the breakdown of Europe is because of you and looking at your own national interests. Thank you.
1 minute, Olaf Stuger.
Ja, voorzitter, dank u wel. We hebben het vandaag over een mogelijke Brexit.
Yes, we're speaking about the possibility of a Brexit, but it's not only that, it is the fragmentation of the European Union, and that's already begun. I can imagine that for many of you, it's difficult to imagine that. People wouldn't have even perceived of such a thing for decades now, but now we have to look at things again, a new reality. And, as mentioned, one has to say very, very clearly, Schengen is dead, period. And one has to repeat that 10 times per day. That's my particular way of dealing with these issues and my solution. Things have simply changed, and we have to accept that, so that the shock isn't as terrible and so that the reverberations of it aren't so catastrophic. But we simply have to realize that Schengen is gone.
Thank you very much. For a minute and a half, Françoise Grostet. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Referendum on the membership of the UK in the EU is a time to say exactly what the EU is about. We have faith in the capacities of our continent, and we must recall that there is only one Europe with its values, its freedom of movement, its single currency and its single market, and Schengen. Should we accept that one country imposes its rhythm on the rest? Yes, because it's important that the UK should stay in the EU, but in a world as unstable as it is, we don't want to see a weakening, and this is the objective that is pursued by those that wish to dismantle Europe. On social protection, let me remind you that any citizen who works, who pays his or her taxes, has right to social protection irrespective of origin, because he or she will contribute to the wealth of that country. Finally, it's not conceivable that we weaken the role of the European Parliament, and we have nothing to blush about vis-à-vis the national parliaments. And in a Europe traumatized by the events of Paris, Cologne and Calais, we must now respond to the frustrations and fears of public opinion, to those who are tempted to see in the fight against Europe and in populism a way out of their own malaise. And I think this is symptomatic of the situation Europe finds itself in today. The European Parliament and Europe has reacted rapidly, but the member states are dragging their feet to implement the decision taken, and we haven't got months now in hand to strengthen our external borders. We have to act. We have to act. This is urgent.
2 minutes now. Tanja Fajon.
Ja. Spoštovani plenum, želim, da velik
distinguished members of Parliament, I wish Great Britain to remain in the European Union. However, Mr. Tusk yesterday submitted summary proposals responding to the demand of Great Britain in order to prevent its departures from the European Union. However, this is precisely what is being done, because changes whereby access to social transfers would be made possible will make legitimate discrimination with different concessions made to different countries. If we do so in the case of Great Britain and foreign workers, we'll have to make concessions, for instance, tomorrow to Bulgaria when it comes to environmental standards, or to Germany in case of safe food. And what will happen in view of the ever greater number of migrants? How quickly will this jeopardize fundamental human rights? That is the foundation for the European Union. I would wish that Great Britain to remain in the European Union, however, without pleasing it in its picky tastes. And from Schengen to budget payments, discounts, and for this reason my country contributes at least 30 million that it could use for solving the migrant crisis, for instance. So are we ready to give in to whims for a state to remain in the European Union? Are we really prepared to do it at any cost? And as we know, there are when we compare it to family, because we cannot yield in to have peace in the house, because the only result would be a breakup of the Union. Thank you.
President, it's my view that the UK proposals, which we now have, form the basis of a good deal, and a deal which includes all 4 of my Prime Minister's major issues of concern. I think that we can confidently put that in due course to the British people. And of course, this is never going to please those who've always wanted to leave the EU regardless, nor will it be music to the ears of Euro-federalists. Some of the details still need to be worked out, and there are still matters that require further discussion. But if we can finalise this work in the upcoming European Council, then we have a deal that I would welcome. But I think we must emphasise that any good deal must also just be the start of wider long-term reforms for the whole continent. And the reforms must not just be for the benefit of the UK, but for the prosperity and the security of the whole EU, and indeed for future generations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Now, a minute for Pavel Telička.
Thank you, Chair, Minister, colleagues. I've made my points on migration yesterday, so just one single sentence. Minister, you have referred to the fact that measures have to be taken as soon as possible. So just let me underline, it is possible and it is badly needed, and now. I think if we don't arrive at a conclusion at the European Council, we will fail. On the UK deal, I think that it is up to the Brits to assess whether it is sufficient. I must say that I very much welcome and appreciate the words of colleague Kirchhoff, because I think that he was the loudest and the clearest on the position. But I must say that I'm not that happy with the deal. I think that there is a certain consequence for the EU. There are consequences for our citizens, for us. But if this is the price to pay for the UK staying in the EU, I'm ready to go along. Two remarks. One is I would have expected to go further on the reforms. Second, I highly appreciate that we have achieved a deal on better regulation, something that myself and a few other colleagues have very much worked on in the past few, let's say, months or a year and a half. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 1 minute now, João Ferreira.
Thank you, President. The European Commission is carrying out a terrible blackmail and pressure operation trying to change the Portuguese government's budget for this year. It's almost colonial in nature. They want to continue the austerity the Portuguese people rejected in the most recent elections. What this is, Mr. Juncker, is that the Constitution of Portugal says that the Portuguese National Assembly has the responsibility of drawing up and adopting the state budget. So please tell your bureaucrats that. They need to, the government needs to comply with the promises it made to the people of Portugal and stop the looting of Portuguese resources. And these goals are limited and modest in nature. They are possibly in contradiction with the rules brought in by Europe, but that shows how wrong Europe was. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr. Ferreira. Now, it's not really quite clear to me why you spoke about a point which is not on the agenda. Now, next speaker, Molly Scott Cato.
Crisis for our continent. Britain must be seen to be strongly committed to the European Union and working in partnership with our European neighbours to achieve the best for our continent as a whole, not seeking to negotiate a special deal based on self-interest. Yesterday we saw what the European Union is really about, when members of the Parliament voted overwhelmingly against fracking operations and to apply the precautionary principle to GMO approvals. We also voted to oppose any revision of the nature directives, which protect some of the UK's best-loved sites and areas of natural beauty. The environment knows no borders, and EU cooperation is essential to protecting our shared heritage. The European Union is a beacon to the rest of the world on standards of environmental protection, animal welfare and employment rights. These things are not red tape, challenging competitiveness, but symbols of living in a civilised society. This is what makes me proud to be a European, and it is what convinces me and my party that we will campaign wholeheartedly for the UK to remain a member of the European Union.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. 1 minute, Peter Lundgren.
Thank you. The problem is that you're not listening to people anymore. You're like crocodiles. Huge gob, small ears. It's been said that problems are spreading. There is a virus. The virus is called arrogance. Arrogance vis-à-vis the concerns of the European population about what is happening in their countries, concerns about not being able to walk down the street safely, concerns about the brutal violence that's increasing, fears of the threat of terror, fear for what's going to happen in your old age, how you're going to get by, quite simply. But are you listening to these concerns? No. You shut yourselves off in arrogance and you're trying to tell people what they should or should not think. It is your views that count and everybody else is labelled stupid, and it's the inability to listen to people's concerns that is at fault here. I hope that the UK leaves and it's the beginning of the end for this disaster that is the EU.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, President. Yes, a point of order about the comment you made after my speech. As you should be aware, one of the points on the agenda for the European Council is the recommendations for the Eurozone. So I think my speech did fit in perfectly with this morning's agenda, so you really shouldn't have said what you said. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Now, for 1 minute, Janice Atkinson.
Well, it's Cam, Sham and Labour will keep the white flag flying, along with the Greens and the remaining Lib Dem. The British public knows that this was a Chamberlain moment, and so do the British newspapers. Let me read to you what the British media are saying. The Sun, who do you think you're kidding, Mr Cameron? The Daily Mail, footling, pedantic and almost ineffective. The Express, a joke. The Mirror, sophistry and spin. Voters are very well informed and they read newspapers. The media matters. There's nothing on agriculture, fishing, trade and environmental policies. Now it's very clear there is no change. No treaty change, no repatriation of British sovereignty. Britain will keep paying the billions into the EU. And crucially, our borders will remain open to migrants and terrorists. The truth is, Cameron got pretty much what he asked for. Absolutely nothing. It means nothing, and this is what the British people will do, and go for Brexit.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And indeed, the point was on the agenda, Mr. Ferreira. Now, Mr. González Pons. Now, the next council will be one of the most important ones of the last years, not only because of the refugee crisis, but also because of the Brexit. The UK is an integral part of the European Union. Without it, the European Union is not complete. Mr. Tusk presented the various issues upon which we can negotiate, and we have to speak. There's a lot to speak about. In order to maintain Europe, we have to speak, we have to negotiate, we have to look at our past. For our future has to be one of peace, and there has to be agreement and harmony. Now, we have to look at the various issues, the basic principles of the European Union, the free circulation of individuals, of goods, and capital as well. And non-discrimination, because this European Union is based on the principle that we are all equal, that we are all equal Europeans. Nobody wants Great Britain to leave. Nobody wants, because it would be something which would spell a it would be a very poor omen for the UK, for the European Union as well. And let's not take into consideration as well the possibility of further fragmentation with Scotland, with Northern Ireland. Let's not forget that we have to, of course, defend the right to have a referendum, and just as, and let's not forget the words of Oscar Wilde, that if we condemn ourselves, we condemn, when we condemn others, we condemn ourselves as well.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, a couple of sentences on Brexit. I read very carefully what we had presented to us, and I have grave concerns. The restriction on freedom of movement, the right not to participate in further integration of the European Union, more liberalism, this is what Mr. Cameron's friends call competition, and not participating in the euro, but being able to have your say, plus all of the existing opt-outs and options. This is what I would call Europe à la carte, and I don't think this is the right way to go. I think the Council needs to take time to discuss the issues here carefully. There is no huge time pressure. Nobody should be applying that pressure on us. We wish to persuade the UK to stay in the EU, but the possibility for the EU to continue to improve, if Mr. Cameron doesn't think it particularly sexy, is nevertheless a right. There are 27 member states who will be taking a view. I'm grateful to Mr. Juncker as well for what he said about the refugee crisis. He talked about the approaching of a saturation level in Jordan and Lebanon vis-à-vis refugees. Yes, that's a point. 1 to 3 in Lebanon and 2 million to 500 million in the richest continent in the world. No, our problem isn't the 2 million refugees, but the fact that we've got wealth in this continent and it's not fairly distributed, and from that we see problems. I would like specifically not always to keep accusing Greece, but to help Greece, and they must allow themselves to be helped, and we must allow the action plan with Turkey to be implemented as swiftly as possible. We need to make sure that we get a move on, and the member states need to ensure that there is a sensible basis upon which that can be done. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fleckenstein, thank you, and now colleague Sulík.
Ursprünglich etwas zum
britischen Referendum sagen.
I wanted to say something about the British referendum, but I see that Mr. Juncker is still here, and I wanted to say something directly to him with regard to the euro. In 1970, 1 German mark was 8 drachmas. 30 years later, in the year 2000, 1 mark is 170 drachmas. If there were no euro, today 1 mark would be 250 drachmas. But no, one said that one for all times, that 1 mark would be 174 drachmas. This is the reality, and the consequences are that the euro is too cheap for Europe, and that's why Germany is the #1 exporter, and for Greece, the euro is just simply too expensive, and that's why Greece imports even tomatoes. Whatever you do, you can't fight against the market. Thank you very much for your attention, Commissioner Juncker, President.
Vielen Dank, Herr Sulík. Hier ist ein Foto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sulík. There was somebody who fell over in the bureau area, which causes a matter of concern in that speech. Maria Desenes is the next speaker.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. I've got 2 specific proposals. First of all, on refugees. You said a few weeks ago, Mr. President, that you were going to give money to Turkey. I don't know whether you have yet, but before you pay them anything at all, demand that Turkey stop the criminal traffic which is going on, funneling Syrian refugees to Europe, and particular to the Greek islands. That's the first thing you've got to do. And at the same time, and this is up to us, let's increase our ability to process asylum requests from where the refugees are, in the camps in Lebanon, Syria or Turkey. On the UK now, this is a personal view, but I think these little friendly arrangements aren't actually going to help David Cameron out. That's possibly another point. But rather than calling into question workers' social rights, not foreign workers, European workers who are working in the UK, please look again at the question of secondment of foreign workers. That will be useful for the whole of the EU. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Neoklis Ilikiotis. Thank you very much, President. In order to confront the refugee crisis, we need a humanitarian approach and solidarity. We cannot continue supporting any sort of policies that will lead to xenophobia, creating a fortress Europe which looks at refugees as a kind of threat to citizens. Aside from the parties of the Third Right, unfortunately, we've seen not only in the right, but also xenophobia in other political camps as well, in the ECR, in the EFD as well, and in numerous different parties of Eastern Europe, and a number of parties which are within the EPP as well. They've been cultivating this atmosphere of xenophobia and racism. Unfortunately, tolerance and failure to manage the refugee crisis by the Council has led to further xenophobia, racism, and violence. The progressive forces have to act together concertedly in order to stop this immediately, so that we don't have a re-emergence of fascism and Nazism in Europe. And finally, let us stop targeting Greece. We have to remember that the people have been... Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter Eriksson for 1 minute.
I should say in this debate that the European Union is not working as it should. Decisions are not taken, although it's necessary and urgent. But the biggest problem is not in the European institutions, it's in the member states and the member countries and the member countries' governments today. In country after country, the discussion goes around me, we, against them, against the refugees, against the other countries. We are asking the wrong questions. In Sweden, in Great Britain, in Poland, we should ask us instead, what is our own responsibilities? What is the leadership we could take, and what can we contribute with to make our part of the world a little better? I should say that Great Britain is a good example. It's a proud honourable people, and it should not be the hit-and-run driver. It should be the leadership in Europe and take that role instead for the future.
Vielen Dank. Eine Minute jetzt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gianluca Buonanno.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, President. Given that President Juncker is here, I've got a question for you right away. You were saying that $130 a barrel for oil was a disaster for the economy, and people lost a lot of money. Now it's less than $30 a barrel, and you say that there's total disaster. There's the stock exchanges are collapsing. Are you taking the mick? People always end up paying the bill for it. This Europe is supposed to be united. What kind of continent have we got? Do you want to defend the people or not? We're talking about the UK. They should choose whether they want to be in Europe or not. What's the problem with that? People ought to be able to decide these things. But if we in Italy were going to say, if we're going to leave Europe, what would you do? Would you give them a load of money? What kind of thinking is that? Mr. Weber over there, who's going on and on about this sort of stuff, he's talking about selfishness, but Germany are the ones who tell us when we have to go to the bathroom, when we can make love, when we can do anything at all. Stop this kind of thing.
Jetzt spricht die Kollegin Elisabetta.
This is Gardini for 1.5 minutes.
Sì, grazie Presidente.
Thank you, President. Whether or not we like the way the European institutions have been put together, sometimes we can see that support for them is lower than 30%. But I'm convinced that more than just bureaucracy and the attempt to manage crises, which have been mentioned already, citizens are disillusioned because of the political weakness of Europe, which has become clear in today's discussion as well. That's why we need to be brave. We need to be brave to stop the European rhetoric on the one hand and facile anti-Europeanism on the other. We've had perfect examples of both of these today. We need to be clear. We need to call a spade a spade. We shouldn't hide behind the various political positions which we have. We shouldn't use language to conceal the differences between us, and we need to make certain people stop this tightrope walking when they say one thing in Brussels and one thing back home. We have massive challenges to face, but do we really think that going back to small home states is going to sort these things out? Surely states need to get together if they want to tackle these enormous challenges. No, we need to get together. This is an opportunity, because these negotiations between the UK and the EU should become a broader debate about the whole role of the European Union. Let's not let slip this opportunity. We can end up with a Europe that's better for everybody.
Jetzt für 2 Minuten, Maria.
Now for 2 minutes, Mrs. Rodriguez.
Dear President of the European Commission, dear President of the European Council, what is at stake for the next European Council is to say, once and for all, if European leaders can think and decide about the European Union as an entity in political, economic and geostrategic terms. Of course, the Brexit issue will be a big test, and we believe that the deal on the table is indeed a fair deal. But the refugees crisis is a much bigger challenge, and what is at stake is to build up a real European border, and the real European border is not a wall, is an infrastructure able to provide relevant services, first of all managing the refugees' flows with European standards, secondly to provide security for European citizens, and third to protect the Schengen area as a big undertaking to foster the single market agenda. But at the same time we cope with these external challenges, we need to address the internal ones. That's why this discussion on euro area recommendation is also so relevant, because we need to have a much better policy mix in the euro area to ensure recovery, which is still not there, and most of all to ensure upward economic and social convergence. We cannot have a situation where some members of the eurozone are pushed for recession again just to address major macro imbalances and flaws of our monetary zone. Of course, we do need to have national effort of investment and reform, but this effort needs to be supported by banking union and fiscal capacity. And most of all, we cannot ask pro-European governments, as the Portuguese and the upcoming Spanish one, to go to this negative road. They are pro-European governments.
Thank you very much. For 1 minute now, Evgen Toženovský.
Děkuji, pane předsedající. Jedním z témat.
Thank you very much, President. One of the issues ought to be the new rules for the UK. I'm certain that the new rules, however, ought not be for the UK. It's important for the entire European Union, and not only because of the possibility of Brexit. We have to look at the possibilities of restarting, of having a functional EU. And for this particular reason, we have to adjust to the world. The world is changing dramatically, so we have to adjust. There are many things which are much more complicated and much more complex, and for this particular reason, we have to have a new approach and new rules. Take into consideration the crisis in the Ukraine, the refugee crisis. As things stand right now, it isn't possible to confront these issues effectively, so we need a whole new set of rules for all of Europe. And now György Schöpflin for a minute and a half.
President, whatever the nature of the final package, the strategy of the United Kingdom has turned out to be a high-risk one. The decision to call a referendum on the UK membership of the European Union is primarily about United Kingdom domestic politics, satisfying the Eurosceptics. Now, let's hope that the package that emerges from the February summit will assuage the dissatisfaction of the Eurosceptics, though I rather doubt it, frankly. Their campaign will certainly continue. What hardly anybody seems to be saying, however, is that there is a two-way relationship between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union. The European Union, therefore, is a stakeholder, indeed a major stakeholder, in the outcome of the referendum. Even if the vote is for staying, much will change. The relationship between the EU and the 27 and the United Kingdom will be conditioned by the sense that the European Union went up to the wire for the United Kingdom, so the United Kingdom had better be more constructive in the future. If, of course, the eventual vote is for leaving, then years of upheaval will follow. For Central Europe, the key question is the free movement of labour, one of the four freedoms. Any derogation from this immediately raises the question of the free movement of the other three, the free movement of capital being a key issue for the United Kingdom. No one wants to see these freedoms endangered.
Thank you very much. Eine Minute jetzt. Josef Weidenholzer.
Mr. Weidenholzer, 1 minute. Thank you very much, Mr. President. The refugee crisis has brought about a rash of council meetings without concrete outcomes. The decisions keep getting put off, and those that are made are not followed up. It's a showplace for nationalism, and it just brings about disappointment. A coalition of the willing hasn't really come about, and the consequences are that we're seeing a closure of a whole series of borders, and the whole of Schengen is challenged. We need ACT, we need aid on the ground, we need external borders that work, and finally we need these long-promised hotspots and a just reallocation of refugees. The citizens of Europe require us at the very least to do this, and we need to ensure that what has been decided ultimately is put into action. Thank you very much, Mr. Weidenholzer. Sander Lunes for 1 minute.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter. To be or not to be together, dat is inderdaad...
Thank you, President. To be or not to be together, that is the question which the UK will have to answer in its referendum. If this agreement is sufficient as far as they're concerned, they can say yes. Europe does need major reforms, and this agreement could be the first step in the direction towards a more effective and more competitive Europe. But Some people seem to mistake their dreams for reality. The dream would be that the UK would leave the EU, that they would move into a sort of second division on the borders of Europe, and then there could be full integration of the remaining states into a kind of European superstate. Well, no, 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 as far as all that is concerned. The heart of Europe has to be the question of unity in diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, a minute and a half from Maria Gabriel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Minister President, we always expect a European Council to take stock and to give prospects. When it comes to migration, I have two comments. First of all, we are going to have to plug the holes in the functioning of hotspots. 300 operations at the moment, and we need to make sure that the 8 others are brought up to speed. We also need to ensure that they work properly. We need to relaunch negotiations where they've been held up for years and ensure that where agreements exist, they are put in place. Now, discussions with the UK. I welcome the desire to move forward quickly to a decision. This is important if we don't wish to create more incomprehension in the minds of European citizens. And in that context, Mr. President, I would like to bring to your attention a number of questions. Firstly, the strengthening of the subsidiarity principle. Can we really go further by giving more a right of blockage to the national parliaments without strengthening the role of the European Parliament? Secondly, in this process with the UK, we are going to allow a member state to ignore one fundamental freedom, and how do we avoid opening a Pandora's box and other member states wishing to call into question some of the fundamental pillars of the Union in the future? I think the dynamism here is very much against what was intended under Lisbon. I hope that negotiations will continue, and at the end of it there will be consensus maintained in the European Union.
Thank you very much. Now 1 minute for Birgit Zippel. Thank you very much. The Schengen space creates a frontierless Europe, and the external borders are European borders. But we have to be ready to accept refugees Europe-wide, and unfortunately what has happened is that the countries on the external borders have been overburdened. So is this fair? Now, we've spoken about Turkey and the 3 million refugees that it is able to host. But we, however, a continent with 500 million, would be overburdened with a figure like that. A very serious discussion indeed. And about the responsibility of Erdogan. Well, first of all, we have to look at our responsibility, clarify what that is. Otherwise, Europe, in the end, will just fall into national egoism, and that is something that I don't want to experience. So, with regard to the Brexit, extras here and there for the UK are not helpful. We have to come to a final decision with regard to this issue. Thank you.
Ludek Niedermayer.
Ludek Niedermayer, please.
Dear colleagues, let me start on migration. I guess for almost a year we are testing solutions that do not work. I mean so-called national solutions. During that time things have got just worse. We have more debates, we have more blame and shaming, we have no improvement. So I clearly support what Mr. Juncker has said. We have on the table a portfolio of solutions, measures, the measures that are linked. We must deliver them. If we do so, we will get gradually the situation under the control. So let me refer to what Manfred Weber said at the beginning. There is no excuse for Council not to act. So I called Council to really act. Finally, we must do it. Otherwise, the cost will be huge. Let me say now 3 points on the Brexit. So first, I appreciate the great effort of President Tusk, Council and all the others involved in addressing requests of Prime Minister Mr. Cameron. I guess they made a great effort. Similarly, I hope they were not only considering how to accommodate his request, but how to make sure that functionality of European Union, that is not great as we know, will not be harmed after the deal is agreed. Let me also express one thing. As I said, there was great effort on the side of Council and European politicians. I guess we need not less effort from Mr. Cameron himself. He should not hesitate to say to British people how important it is for British to stay. I hope he knows about it. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Niedermayer. Eine Minute, Patricia Toia.
1 minute now for Patricia Toia.
I 2 punti all'ordine del giorno del prossimo Consiglio ed è ancora una volta il tema dell'immigrazione.
Once again, the issue of immigration. This flow of refugees and the request of the UK to reduce the particular figures, and the citizens of Europe which have to bear the various burdens that are related to this. So we have to come to some sort of closure with regard to these different issues, and we have to confront the new times that exist before us. And if we don't do so, the threat exists that we may simply spiral into a stage of total decadence. So day after day, what we've seen are various measures which haven't really rectified the situation but have destroyed Europe. So it won't be the end, it will be the end for everybody, not for individual member states, but for everybody if we don't adopt joint measures to deal with the various challenges that exist before us. Even in my country, we do have the desire and the hope that we'll be able to respond positively. Otmar Karas, please.
Thank you. Mr. Juncker, ladies and gentlemen, I call on the Council at the next summit to consider Robert Schumann's quote, "The European Union does not emerge at one blow. It is brought together by events and an expression of solidarity." The expression of solidarity and the taking of responsibility for the community, for all 508 million citizens, is something which we sorely lack at the moment. Where are the next integration steps for a common foreign and security policy to ensure that the causes of the refugee crisis are stemmed? Where are the actions for a common security policy to ensure that we get our external borders protected? Where is the common defense policy to ensure that the fight against ISIS can be fought together? And where are the efforts that we need to see on asylum, migration and integration in a common social policy of the internal market on a continent which is a social market economy by nature? It is constantly being said, where is the EU? I would ask you, where are the member states? Where are they when it comes to the implementation of the 7 decisions of the Commission and the Parliament? Where is the Council when it comes to the implementation of the 7 proposals by the Commission which are not yet decided? And where will the Council be when the proposals need to be followed up that do not call into question and threaten the project that is Europe?
Peter Niedermüller for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The European Union is in a critical stage. The migration crisis, Schengen, economic crisis, the the British referendum, and the fundamental values of the EU being attacked in some member states. All this is looking for a solution that is found in common, because these are decisive issues for the coming decades, for our children, for our grandchildren. We're at a crossroads, I'd say. Either we're courageous enough to look forward and find solutions, or we'll see everything collapse that we have built. We can't accept apparent solutions that are not in line with the fundamental values of the EU, human rights and solidarity. Selfishness will take us back in time, which is why we'll have to extend and deepen cooperation inside the EU. We need a common Europe and common European policy. Thank you.
Minute and a half, Ms. Switzer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Solidarity and responsibility are keywords here. I agree with my colleague. Therefore, we cannot go forwards without it. It would be a historical mistake if the European Union were not able to manage this process, this crisis. So we need solidarity, but primarily we need to be responsible. I agree with the question posed. Would it be better for us to live within our national states independently or jointly in the European Union? We have opted for the EU and we wish to live within the EU, and we need to resolve all of these issues together. This is the key, staying together. We have all the regulations necessary, however, these are not applied. So we need to apply, to implement everything which has already been adopted. Primarily, I'm referring to Greece here. We need to strengthen Greece, the European Coast Guard. We need to strengthen our agencies, and this is at the crux of the problem. We need to see how to fill up the fund for Turkey. We have been debating this for months, but we cannot and seem not to become active. I would not like to mention Brexit here today. This would not even be an issue if it weren't for the migration, for all the events on the global level. As the English say, to be or not to be. I hope that we are getting closer to the reply to this question after Mr. Cameron, the Commission and the Council have given their say. We need the Council to take the leadership and not to restrain to the national egoism. Thank you.
Thank you, President. The proposed solution for the British question contains elements which are significant concessions by the other member states, and also some that are symbolic or trivial. Labour would not have gone down the route chosen by Mr. Cameron, but we recognise its significance. We also share the concerns that many colleagues have expressed about these significant concessions that have been given, especially perhaps those that affect the welfare rights of employed, tax-paying European citizens working in Britain. But we also note that Mr. Cameron has not managed to, or even I think attempted to, perhaps thanks to our pressure, weaken the social chapter of the treaty that enshrines workplace rights. There are other things that he has not managed to do, and of that we are also glad. But whatever one's view of the package that is there, we have to bear in mind that there is a much, much bigger question at stake: the very membership of Britain of the European Union, the threat of the breakup of the European Union. That has to be our overriding consideration. And whether Mr. Cameron's package helps secure the result necessary in this referendum in all our interests, I think that has to be our overriding consideration. If the concessions help, and they will help, win that battle, then that is something we all have to take account. It is an overriding importance. There is far too much at stake for us to quibble or to try to oppose this package, even if many colleagues are understandably not entirely happy with it. I would urge you nonetheless to accept it. Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. 1 minute and a half now, Manolis Kefalogiannis.
Thank you, President. The complexity of the question of refugees is obvious, and it is something at the top of the agenda of the European Council. There are national responsibilities. We have pushed off the question of refugees, and it cannot be solved unless we solve the problem in Syria. The problem in Syria cannot be solved unless we manage to bring the conflict to an end. There are certain responsibilities in the EU as well. Our confusion facing this great problem, a lack of mechanisms, and that's why we need to make more effort. Obviously, we need to protect the frontiers, the borders of the EU, Greece, Italy in particular, because they are at the heart of the cyclone, and we have to respect commitments to member states. Member states should also respect their commitments, primarily Greece, but we need solidarity first. And then there are problems in Turkey as well. You can't fight against the traffickers' network without visas for Maghreb countries, and there are hundreds of thousands of refugees, migrants from the North Africa who are trying to get into the EU illegally. So we absolutely have to do something in Asia Minor. We have to have identification of the boats in the Aegean, and we need to deal with the question of illegal immigrants. We've got to tackle the problem of refugees. We hope that Europe will find a solution to this major issue. Thank you.
Catherine Styler, 1 minute.
There are some useful things, there are some trivial things, and there are some things we don't particularly like. But the referendum is not yes or no to Cameron's deal, but the much bigger question of whether the UK should leave or remain in the EU. I believe, and my party believes, that remaining in the EU is in the best interest of Britain's economy and security, good for jobs, workplace rights, the environment, and to face our future challenges not through isolation but through cooperation. The alternative, which the Eurosceptics peddle, is for the UK to walk away, have no say, but still have to pay. And to the Scottish nationalists, this is not about when a referendum will be, but about the future of Scotland being part of the EU through the UK and the benefits we gain for jobs and working people in Scotland. I want the UK to remain part of the EU family for our long-term future as a country and our long-term prosperity as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A minute and a half now, Paulo Rangel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before entering on the main subject, which is the UK question, I would like to say to Ms. Rodrigues that I don't know if the Portuguese government is pro-European. The Communist Party here has made a totally anti-European statement here, and as the Portuguese government depends on the support of the Communist Party and another anti-market party, I really wonder about the European convictions of this government, particularly as Mr. Costa has made some completely new remarks about the EU. I would recall to the radical left that they are involved in this government, and so they are holding the government hostage to a position in which they will not be able to comply with all of their obligations. Having said that, I am very satisfied with President Tusk's proposal. I think it is of vital importance that we keep the UK in the EU. The UK guarantees balance in the EU, vital for countries such as Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, countries that have perhaps more of a maritime heritage than a purely continental one. So I think it's vital that we keep Britain in so that we have an all-round balance, not just a north-south balance. And I think what President Tusk said has represented a great step forward.
Mrs. Rodrigues has been spoken to personally, not a blue card, but under Article 164.
Senhor Deputado Paulo Rangel, a sua alegação em relação ao governo português não podia evidentemente ficar sem resposta.
Mr. Rangel, I don't think your comments about the Portuguese government can go unanswered. We all know that the Portuguese government is a government of unity on key issues that it faces with regard to the Schengen area, with regard to the UK question, with regard to the refugee crisis. And the government maintains solidarity, a position of solidarity on European issues. We have a government that wishes to apply a new strategy with regard to Portugal to get out of a deadlock.
1 minute for Jeppe Kofod.
No, I just said it is not a blue card. I do not admit blue cards. This was an intervention under Article 164 of the Rules of Procedure, answering a personal statement. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Some people in the hemicycle would like to talk about more or less EU, as if you could roll it out and divide it up once a year to see if there's a bit less or a bit more EU. That doesn't work. So we need to have a better EU, not more or less EU, a more focused and efficient EU based on our citizens and the common problems. I would like to praise President Tusk for his amendments presented yesterday to give a red card to national parliaments on EU proposals. What we need is a better way to work together a division of labour so that the EU is big on big things and small on small things. There ought to be reasonableness in access to social security systems. There should be a principle that those countries you work in, where you pay tax in, provides care. So there should be equal treatment there for the EU citizens. Thank you. 1 minute for Milan Sver.
Ladies and gentlemen, Winston Churchill was among the first who presented the vision of the United States of Europe. I never had any doubts about the wisdom of the UK. Therefore, I know that the decision taken at the referendum will be sensible and theirs. But it would be bad to impose solutions to the UK. I trust that they will take their decisions on the basis of information, and that they will recognize that the exit would be bad for them and for us. And this would just be good for those who do not wish anything good neither to us nor to the UK. But the European Union must present its position. President Tusk did it yesterday. The agreement must be just for the sake of the 28 member states. I believe the EU should be strong, immune to stresses, and even more flexible. And the instrument of the emergency brake is a solution in this direction. In brief, the European Union needs innovative solutions for better functioning, even if this requires the changes in the treaty. But this agreement should be a single instrument. It shouldn't trigger off effect.
Now, Irache García Pérez.
Thank you, President. There are crises attacking the heart of the European project, the euro, Brexit, refugees. And not only do we need a European Commission which is able to make proposals, but we also need a Council which is up to the situation and which is capable of having dialogue and understanding and finding a solution to all these problems. Because we shouldn't set obstacles in the course of the search for solutions which are essential for the European Union today. And I want to answer Mr. Weber regarding his concerns about the future government of Spain and tell him that, first of all, you cannot foresee what will happen, and secondly, you have to respect democratic processes. Today, the Socialist Party has a mandate to form a government because the People's Party gave up that task, because after 4 years of an absolute majority they were incapable of holding dialogue with the other political forces. And I agree with what you said, Mr. Weber. We don't want a government of radicals, but I'm sure that you would agree with me that people want a clean government which is free of corruption.
Thank you. Mr. Christopherou, now for 1 minute.
Mr. President, we in Europe would like to achieve a strong European Union. We can't imagine the EU without the UK. It's easy to criticize the EU, but I think we would do the Commission an injustice if we said the Commission isn't trying very hard to address some of the most serious problems that it has had to face since it was founded. The Greek crisis, the refugee crisis, terrorism, the whole question of investment. It's easy to criticize the Commission and the EU, and we do it very often, but we don't pay attention to the success stories. We should be happy to have this Commission and this President of the Commission in this difficult time. Without a strong Commission, we will be much worse off. But there's another point that I would like to make as well. It would be good if we could get clarification from the Commission and Council on this, but I'm afraid the speaker has been cut off.
Claire Moody, 1 minute.
President, and thank you to colleagues here for the support for my country remaining in the EU. I hope an agreement is reached in February. Only through reaching that agreement can we finally get on to the referendum campaign and fight for Britain to remain in the EU. Citizens in the UK already benefit from our membership of the EU, benefit from jobs,
from rights in those jobs, like the right to paid holiday, from protection of our environment, tackling tax avoidance, dealing with climate change, and protecting our security. Our future also lies on our membership of the EU. Future in innovation, in development, in research, future economy. So please get that agreement at the Council in February and let us take the campaign on to keep Britain at the heart, stronger in the EU.
Thank you. Mrs. Niebler now, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. President of the Commission, President in Office. We have Carnival in my country soon, but people don't want to celebrate. People are afraid, concerned. They have doubts. They can't see how the EU will master the refugee crisis. Use the summit, President in Office, and put pressure on the member states who don't do their homework, those member states who make commitments at the summit and don't deliver what they've promised. If the Greek government can't secure the external border, they must have assistance. The hotspots must be set up so that if people enter the Schengen area, they're registered. We must know who's with us in the European Union. I would like to support my chairman, Manfred WEBER, when he says that the Council must show courage, shoulder responsibility, and the EU hold the EU together, because it's given us peace and security for 70 years. Elisa Ferreira for 1 minute.
Thank you. What we are witnessing is attacks on our work. And now I'd like to make an appeal to Jean-Claude Juncker. It is important for the European Commission to be impartial and not to give in to the pressure. As regards to Mr. Tusk's proposal, it is a very good basis for work. It is essential for the UK to stay in the EU, but it is also important to guarantee that the progress to be made now regarding the single currency really is possible, so that progress really can be brought about. So we are hoping that by going into the details of the proposal on the table at the moment, it will be possible for the UK to have a more stable relationship with the rest of the EU and the other.
Now Speaker Tony Kalam, 1 minute.
Vielen Dank. 3 points. First, the efficient protection of the EU external border is first of all dependent on the responsibility of the member states coming forward with financing they have committed themselves to. And also we need to be prepared to defend our eastern border. Second, UK. I think Europe should concentrate on positive complementarity, trying to separate crucial issues from domestic policy debates. I fully agree with our British friends that the EU should become truly competitive to finally complete the single market and conduct radical deregulation. And third, my special message to the Dutch presidency, to see the data protection package as a matter of urgency, to decide about it already by March, so that it could be adopted by the Parliament in April. In fact, any delay means postponing chances of developing the single digital market, as well as providing our citizens with reliable protection.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tone. We now come to the Catch the Eye procedure, but as we have Council and Commission coming back in, we will have a shortened Catch the Eye with 2 speakers. The first one is Henna Virkkunen. For 1 minute, please.
President, the EU summit is very important for the future of the EU. The refugee crisis has to be solved. We need a common migrant policy. We have to make new decisions, but even more important is to implement the decisions already taken. Setting up hotspots, dealing with the external borders, a better distribution throughout the EU. These have been half done or haven't been implemented at all. The member states have to take this seriously and to implement the decisions being taken. It's a question of the credibility of the whole of the EU. Another issue, the UK membership. I don't think the model gives a possibility to reach an agreement. The EU needs the UK. The UK needs the EU. But we must remember that at the moment, the UK has a lot of more opt-outs than any other member state.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Also for sticking to the time. Anna Gomes, 1 minute.
Shame on Mr. Weber and Mr. Rangel for attacking the Portuguese clearly pro-European government as extremists. Extremists are those who stick to stupid, self-defeating, anti-growth, anti-job creation policies in Europe, fostering inequality, injustice and distrust of the citizens in the EU. That said, queremos o Reino Unido na União Europeia, mas não podemos continuar a tolerar.
We do not think we can allow the powers of the EU to be constrained when it comes to defence policy. When we face major threats and challenges globally that require stronger cooperation between member states. Mr. Juncker said that we have to end the war in Syria if we want to put an end to the refugee crisis. Fine, but Syria is not the only problem. There is the problem in Libya as well that nobody seems to be concerned about. There are many examples of where Europe has failed. Thank you.
Now for the Commission, the President, Jean-Claude Juncker. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. I always try to stay for the whole debate and listen to it. I always take the trouble to do that myself, unlike all members. It occurs to me that everybody is complaining that Europe is becoming more and more national. The governments are dealing with their own problems instead of the problems of Europe. We have to keep making appeals to the member states' governments to remember what is going on at European level, and all those who say that are right, but it is very difficult to maintain this credibility. And I find that we seem to be having domestic policy debates here time and time again. And those in the opposition at home are using the European Parliament to attack their governments, and those who are in government in their countries are representing their governments and criticising the proposals of the opposition at national level. And that's not the type of European Parliament that we want if it is to play its proper role in Europe. So I'm not going to answer those questions because those are not genuine questions to the Council or Commission. These are just skirmishes between the groups. It's primitive party politics, and I'm not prepared to get involved in that kind of behaviour. Otherwise, since I have to deal with the major principles at all, I would insist on 2 or 3 points. Some of our colleagues have said that the Commission should not deal with national budgets, and that's not true. There's a treaty, there's a Growth and Stability Pact, there are country-by-country recommendations, there are debates in the Eurogroup and Council, and the Commission has to play its full role. It's true for the budgets which are being scrutinised by the Commission at present, and it's true in general for all the budgets in which the Commission will play a full role. The Commission has introduced some aspects of flexibility as regards the interpretation of the Growth and Stability Pact, and the elements of flexibility are quite enough to permit the different member states, even those struggling with current problems, to be able to propose budgets which are in line with all the rules and requirements. On Brexit, I won't say any more, because everything has been said. I'd just like to make one comment. Apart from the UKIP representatives and other political parties on the extreme wings of this House, all members, all political parties in Parliament have pleaded to keep the UK in the EU. So if we really want to do that, we shouldn't be surprised that the representatives of the Council and Commission and others are having negotiations with the British Prime Minister. It might be enough to say that the UK should stay in the EU, and you can't really refuse dialogue. If you say that, you can't refuse dialogue with representatives of the UK government. If we want the UK to stay in the EU, we've got to have discussions with it, and we have to talk to the representatives of the UK. Otherwise, as I said, just to make things quite clear, the fact that the UK is going to hold a debate leading to a referendum should not lead us to cease all other activities in the European Union. During the Greek crisis, very frequently we were asked not to do this, not to do that, give up this or that initiative, not propose this or that. And the UK will have a democratic debate to its honour, but the Commission will continue its work. And that's the reason why, in terms of social policy, during the next few weeks and months, we'll be developing a certain number of initiatives. We'll be proposing a package on mobility. And don't tell us we shouldn't do it, because our British friends are having a debate at home. We're going to propose a pillar, a body of social rights and law. We'll be launching consultation in March, and we'll be proposing amendments to the directive on posting of workers. It's an absolute necessity, and we shall do that.
Thank you very much, President. For the Council now, President Bert Koenders.
And I thank the members of the European Parliament for the debate and for the many questions that were raised. I think it is true that the next European Council will be crucial on very important aspects of the definition of our Union. It will deal with the two elements that determine our collective will to confront common challenges. One, obviously, is the debate on the United Kingdom. I'll come back to that in a second. And yes, it's true. As Mr. Weber has said, it requires a certain amount of courage and leadership to deal with these two issues, not at the price of discussing many other challenges in the European Union. The position of the United Kingdom in the European Union, as well as the improved management of the refugee crisis, we've talked about that for many hours yesterday, is obviously the key for the decisions that we will have to make in February. I think it's important to say, first of all, that I'm encouraged by the level of support that I hear about the type of package that has been proposed by President Tusk. Of course, the devil is in the detail, everything has to be weighed, but nevertheless, I feel a large majority of the European Parliament here feels that there is an interest of keeping the United Kingdom in the European Union, not at the highest price, but at a reasonable, constructive debate. This is important news. You are partners in this. You will be consulted. You have your Sherpas. You will be part of the Council meetings. And of course, it might involve changes to secondary legislation, and therefore also your role is essential, and your concerns need to be addressed. This package has to be fair to the United Kingdom, but to all citizens in Europe. I think it's absolutely important to underline that in all aspects, including the most complex part, which deals with social benefits. We have to talk about a fairer internal market, a deeper and a fairer internal market, and we will have to see in the discussions in the Council what the conclusions will be in February. Many elements in the package benefit us all, such as more competitiveness and a deeper internal market, but as I said, the fairness is also an important point on this. I would like to say that it gratifies me also to hear Mr. Kamall speaking. He qualifies this package at least as a good starting point. That gives me hope that the negotiations will be constructive. On the issue of ever closer union, I think was mentioned by Mr. Verhofstadt, I don't think it would be a good idea if there would be an opt-out for the United Kingdom. I'd like to remind you that in Article 1 of the treaty it states very clearly an ever closer union between the peoples of the European Union. That is what is written in the treaty. For some it might mean a federal Europe, for others it might be another connotation. But what we do in the draft European Council decision is to clarify that in itself it doesn't offer a legal basis to transfer competences to the European Union. That is a statement of fact, nothing more, also nothing less. At the same time, the draft European Council decision states that the treaties allow for a deeper degree of integration, and I think that is your point. So the treaties do not offer an obstacle to your vision of Europe, but neither do they oblige us to transfer competences, and therefore I would think it would not be wise to look at an opt-out. Then on the refugee crisis, I will not take time for you. We have discussed it at length yesterday. I would say on Article 78.3, this is a possibility, but don't forget we have at the moment a borders package which is being discussed every month in detail to make sure that we come to the quickest discussion on this. The EU interior ministers discussed these issues at their informal gathering held in Amsterdam on the 25th and the 26th, and this will continue to be done consecutively. So we don't need the article to do it quicker. What you need is the reality on the ground, that we have the right people on EASO and Frontex and on the hotspots. Let me say in conclusion the importance of Schengen. The continuing flow of migrants over the past months has seen several countries temporarily reimpose border controls. I would like to say here that the Presidency is committed to securing the maintenance of Schengen, a system which is at the heart of the European project and one of the greatest achievements of European integration. And we will do all we can do to find, on the basis of the expected Commission proposal and in cooperation with the Commission, the European Parliament and the Member States concerned, a solution to the current problems. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Minister, that concludes the debate. We'll now continue the sitting with the formal session.
Président Buhari, président de la République fédérale du Nigeria.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident!
Esteemed President Buhari, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I would like to wish His Excellency, the President of Nigeria, a warm welcome to the European Parliament. Mr. Buhari was elected in March 2015 as President of Nigeria. He has proposed a very comprehensive reform agenda following this peaceful transition. He's vowed to combat corruption in his country and to invest in the country's economy, but above all, he is determined to combat terrorism in Nigeria. We all know that the atrocities of Boko Haram affect this country and are in the forefront of all of our minds when we witness the atrocious attacks that took place only last weekend. 85 people have lost their lives, at least that's the death toll that we're aware of so far, and we would like to express our condolences and solidarity to the President. I have also assured President Buhari that the European Union, and in particular the European Parliament, will support him in his fight against terror in his country. At the same time, of course, we want to support the process of reform in Nigeria, and we are ready here, Mr. President, in the European Parliament to do what we can to ensure that investments are made in the Nigerian economy and that we can build up trade with your country. So once again, a warm welcome on behalf of the European Parliament. And I give you the floor, sir.
The President of the European Parliament, Mr. Martin Schulz, the Vice President of the European Parliament, the European parliamentarians, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my utmost appreciation to the President of the European Parliament, Mr. Martin Schulz, for inviting me to address